I think my neighbor's cat warded off a skinwalker. My father died about 5 years ago, unexpectedly from a heart attack. To say it was hard on my mother and I was an understatement. Our old house in Knoxville just didn't feel like home anymore. About a year later, Mum and I made plans to take ourselves and our elderly dog Ace on a move further south to a small town situated about half an hour from Atlanta. Just a few days before we were slated to move, however, I had one of the most vivid dreams I've ever come to experience. All that was written in my dream was my bedroom, a picture perfect recreation of the real thing. I sometimes wonder if I was in some sort of sleep paralysis state when it occurred. To further add to the dream's realism, in the middle of the night, the street lights right across the street would illuminate through my window, creating a light reflection on the wall perpendicular. In my dream, as I lay there staring at the exact reflection on the wall, I saw an orb of smoke fading from the shadows. Goosebumps chilled across my skin as I lay there panicked and afraid to move a muscle. Suddenly, it stopped moving and steadily hung in the light's reflection, as if it was staring at me. Without warning, it spoke to me in my dead father's voice. I'm sending something to watch you. Despite hearing my father's voice come from the orb, I was terrified of it. I didn't know why, and yet I managed to squeak out a small reply towards it. What? I whispered. The orb remained silent for a few moments, leaving an eerily dead silence in the voice's place. Just as quickly, it spoke to me one final time. Damn black. I woke up almost instantaneously, gasping for breath. The nightmare had chilled me to my core. I didn't know exactly what to make of it, especially those two final words. I chalked it up to maybe Dad wishing us well on our move. But at the time, I couldn't shake the feeling it was some kind of warning. Within the next couple of weeks, my mother and I moved out of Knoxville and headed down south to Georgia. She had managed to find a quaint little house for us, with only one or two neighbors down a gravel road in the middle of the woods. It was a nice fit for us, probably the best reliever of all the stress that came with the move. However, was our new neighbor's cat. She was a petite, older black cat that gravitated towards me almost instantly, and I treated her as if she was my own pet. I left out a can of food once or twice a week for her, and even if I didn't call out for her, when she saw me outside, she would always run up to me. She helped ease my tensions about leaving Knoxville behind, especially without Dad there with us. Less than a month into our new house, I awoke suddenly to a faint coughing noise that sounded like it was coming from downstairs. One important thing to know about our dog Ace is that he has a collapsed trachea. He needs medicine to help calm the condition down, so I'm used to waking up in the middle of the night to give him his medicine. I proceeded downstairs from my bedroom to give him his cough medicine, but I couldn't find him anywhere throughout the house. He wasn't in his bed sleeping, he wasn't in the kitchen, he was nowhere to be found. I didn't check Mom's bedroom, however, as to avoid waking her up. Besides, I wouldn't have heard the coughing if he had been in there anyway, so I just let it be. That's when I heard the cough again, but it was coming from further away, as if from outside. it looked over at the side patio door leading out into the woodlands and realized I had forgotten to shut it. There it stood, slightly ajar. Shiz! I thought to myself. He got out! I immediately ran outside with a flashlight and started calling out for my dog. Ace! Ace! I shouted into the neighbouring trees. I heard another cough and shined my light in its direction. That time it had echoed from down the gravel road. I swear a path had never looked so terrifyingly desolate before in my life that night. As I stared down the small gravel road that had led us to our new home, but in that moment I thought my dog was lost, and I chalked it up to new house jitters, so I pressed onward. Ace, come on boy, home this way buddy. That's when I heard it, the cough that I had been following, almost right beside me, but this time it didn't stay like the dry cough I had been hearing. Instead, the cough had slowly descended into a low growl. I shined my light towards the new sound. There stood a bright red fox in the middle of the path. For a moment I figured it was some kind of sick fox I had mistaken for my dog the whole time, as I was processing what I was seeing. It stared directly at me. Its eyes glowed from the light of my flashlight. However, our stare broke when it tilted its head to the right. I looked down and there she was, our neighbour's little black cat standing beside me. However, it was as if she had completely changed persona. She was no longer the happy, affectionate cat I had come to know. Instead, she had her back arched upright, every fibre of her hair standing at attention, and uttered the lowest growl I had ever heard come out of a feline. In that moment, I figured she was scared of the fox, so I kneeled down beside her in a bid to coax her away and avoid the fox hurting her. But no matter how many times I tried to coax her out of fight mode, she wouldn't budge. Her stare remained unfazed. That's when I looked towards the direction of the fox once more. But there wasn't a fox standing there anymore. Instead, in the exact same spot on that gravel road was a walking, rotting corpse of a roadkill coyote, slowly moving towards me. I took a step back, absolutely horrified of what was I seeing. Its jaw was hanging loose from its face. One of his eyes was stained with blood, and it wobbled back and forth as if it was desperately fighting pain. I rubbed my eyes out of disbelief, hoping I was imagining it. But it was still there when my eyes reopened, despite the gruesome sight before us. Our neighbour's black cat, no longer how tiny she was, stood there and kept growling at the creature. Suddenly, it stopped. The creature had ceased its walk towards us. For a moment, it just stood there, glancing back and forth between myself and this little black cat that was trying to defend me. That's when I unmistakably heard this beast mutter two solemn words in a low, gravelly voice. Damn, black. In a flash, the creature ran straight into the woods. I shined my flashlight in its direction, but it had completely vanished. Even the brush it had run through looked untouched. That's when the cat, still standing beside me, calmed herself down, almost as if nothing had happened. She rubbed herself up against my leg, returning to her normal loving mood. Despite technically not being mine, I proceeded to scoop her up and run back into the house. Before heading upstairs with the little black cat snuggled up my arms, I decided to poke my head into my mother's room. Laying on the floor, sound asleep, was Ace. He had been there the entire time. I quietly closed her door before bolting upstairs. I made sure that the little cat slept with me in my bed that night. From the research I've done, I think I was almost a victim of some kind of skinwalker. I must have picked up the sounds my dog sometimes makes late at night, knowing I'd likely come to his aid for whatever reason. Our neighbor's black cat had scared it so badly, it scrambled away. I haven't seen it since that night. Maybe because that same cat still likes to wander down the gravel road late at night. Or maybe that thing just decided I wasn't worth the trouble. Either way, whether I have my father or pure luck to thank, I leave a can of food out every single night for that little black cat. And the most ironic part of it all, that cat's name is Halloween. My friend's Skinwalker story. Back in college, a buddy and I were hanging out in our dorm room, smoking some weed and chilling. We get on the top of creepypastas and stuff. And I mentioned that I've heard some really creepy Skinwalker stories. My buddy gets really quiet out of nowhere. I saw one once, up close and personal. That shiz is real, bro. Of course, I asked him to tell me more. He said he didn't like talking about it, but eventually opened up. So his story took place back in the summer before he left for college. Him and his high school friend group had planned a big last hooray camping trip. He was from Scottsdale, AZ, and I think he said they only drove a good hour and a half outside the city to one of their friends' parents' ranching properties. There's about 8 people in their group and everyone shows up around the same time in 3 separate cars. Around when they show up, it's already starting to get late and dark, so they set up their tents and a campfire and start drinking and smoking. This one dude in their group, let's call him Tim, is being a little more quiet than usual. My buddy asks him what's wrong and he says something like, "I don't feel good, just a little under the weather today." Regardless, they start making brats and all having a good time. Then out of nowhere, everyone notices Tim is gone. Just totally vanished. Nobody even saw him leave, even though everyone was relatively close to the fire. The group starts calling his name, thinking he's pranking everyone. Then they start to get worried once Tim has been gone for over an hour. So my friend and a couple others go out into the hills to search for him. They walk around for a good 15 minutes, calling his name before they finally get a response. It's not Tim. Instead, they hear the familiar howl of a coyote, and it's answered by a couple other coyotes. My buddy says he was little worried at this time for Tim, that he had been dragged off by wild animals. Everyone in their group was paranoid because there's no way Tim could have gone missing without anyone noticing. Just no way. They hear another howl. Suddenly, it's longer than the others, and different in that it sounds off like if someone had a recording of a coyote howling and decided to play it. My friend's blood ran cold when the howl ended in a sort of hacking laughter. And unlike the howl, the laughter sounded close, like 20 feet away close. The group starts frantically looking around, convinced Tim is out there effing with them. He isn't. They don't see anyone. They return to the fire a little shaken up. Everyone is starting to get worried at this point. The group starts considering calling the police when suddenly a truck pulls up to the campsite. It's Tim's truck. Tim steps out of it and is wondering why everyone has been freaking out. Tim says he's sorry. He got off work 2 hours late and hurried out to the ranch as fast as he could. This is when the group realizes that Tim didn't carpool there with anyone. As if on cue, they hear another long, drawn-out howl, just like the other one. At that point, the group noped the F out there. They ended up paying to camp in a designated campground, and the night went on as normal. But my friend still says he thinks about when he asked him if he was alright. He claims that at the time he could definitely tell something was off about him, but he didn't think anything of it. But now he's 100% convinced that Tim was some sort of skinwalker, entity impersonating his friend for shiz and giggles. How the creature knew what Tim looked and sounded like? Well, he has no explanation for that. Maybe it just got inside their heads. I think I encountered a skinwalker. I have no evidence, but I promise you all this story is real. Sorry for the wall of text. I've always been a bit of a skeptic ever since I was a kid. Scary stories don't faze me. Horror games never frighten me. And whenever I hear something weird at night, I instantly assume it's something normal, an animal, or just the house setting. Despite this, something very unsettling happened to me the other day, and I'm really not sure what to make of it. I think it's the first time in years I've been genuinely frightened. I live in a forested area in the US. Me and my girlfriend live in a large cabin, and although there are groves nearby, our nearest neighbors are at least a kilometer away. We also have 2 cats, one of which sleeps in the bedroom with us, whilst the other often goes out at night and does whatever cats do when they're out of sight. Anyway, I like to stay up late at night and sleep late into the morning, whereas my girlfriend's an early bird. It was about 1 in the morning and I was watching crappy TV in the living room whilst my girlfriend slept in the bedroom. I was beginning to grow tired when I heard something outside, near the cat flap. For clarity, our cat flap uses an electronic chip, so only our cats can use it. I assumed it was just one of the cats coming into or leaving the house, and I ignored it. Then I heard it again. It sounded like something thudding against the flat. It happened several times at random intervals, until I lost my patience and decided to just go and open the door. Clearly, the cat was having trouble getting in. I never thought about it at the time, but this was weird because we feed our cats well, and they're very lean rather than chubby. I passed the bedroom and peered in as I walked past to see if my girlfriend heard the noises. She was fast asleep, but the cat that sleeps with us was staring at the window. I called her name. Nothing. She kept staring. I shrugged it off and kept heading towards the kitchen. The back doors are through there, by the way. Anyway, so I reached the back door and saw a dog shape through the translucent flap. I sighed, expecting the cat to be out there, and opened the door. It took me a moment to open the door, and I saw the cat tense up as I opened the door. The door opened fully. I froze. It wasn't my cat. Whatever it was had started moving before I opened up, and I only caught a glimpse of a distorted figure, kind of like a tailless dog, bolting, and I mean absolutely pelting it. I freaked out and slammed the door shut. What the hell was that? I wasn't sure. My natural skepticism kicked in, and I assumed it was just my other cat, and I had merely startled it. Perhaps the darkness had made it appear larger. Nevertheless, I was creeped out and decided to go to sleep. As I slipped into bed, I realized something horrifying. The second cat was asleep on the rug. It took a while to get to sleep that night. Everything seemed normal until a few hours later. I woke to a strange feeling of dread. Something wasn't right. My girlfriend was fast asleep. I held my breath and heard something creaking by the door. It sounded too loud to be one of the cats. It was as if a person was walking around. I reached towards my bedside cabinet and flicked on the lamp. The room was illuminated and I saw something standing just outside the open door, staring at me. The same twisted figure I had spotted outside earlier. It wasn't very tall, maybe a little over 5 feet, but it was its face that scared me the most. I only caught a glimpse of it, but what I saw will stay with me forever. It looked like a dog, but with an elongated face and almost human-like eyes. You know that weird, distorted snarl hounds pull when they pissed off? It had that expression. I instantly started yelling profanities as I scrambled backwards, trying to straighten up. The creature turned and sprinted down the hall. I heard it dash outside and go past the window behind us, just above the headboard. I managed to look out as my girlfriend started to panic as she woke up fully. We both caught a glimpse of whatever the hell this thing was as it dashed off into the woods near our house. Grabbing my trusty shotgun from beneath the bed, as well as a couple rounds from the ammunition box that sits next to it, I ran out of the room in my underwear and rounded into the kitchen. The door was open. I had forgotten to lock it when I saw the thing originally. I haven't seen it since, and we still live in our cabin, but I've brought sturdy locks for all of the main doors and windows in the home, and always check the exit points at night. I also go to bed a bit earlier than I used to, so I'm asleep when the freaks of the night start to wake up. I have read a bunch of forums, and the only thing I can compare it to, based on what I saw, is a skinwalker. If you know anything about these things, please let me know. Edit. I wrote daughter by mistake. Sorry about that. I don't actually have a daughter. Also, for those who are asking, I'm originally from England, then moved overseas later on in life. I always preferred using kilometers as I just find them easy to use, and any spelling mistakes are just me being an idiot who can't spell. Something appeared in the woods. An ex-girlfriend of mine used to live on this small rural island in Minnesota called Grey Cloud Island. At one point, the island had the highest concentration of Indian burial mounds in the country. There is a lot of history there, and it, at one time, was considered sacred. I'm sure you all know how that went. At any rate, across the street from my ex's mailbox was a long, overgrown gravel driveway blocked off by a rusty chain. On one of our late evening jots, we decided to step over the chain and make our way down this driveway, which was a good quarter of a mile long, if not more. The driveway opened up into a small clearing of sorts, in the center of which was all that remained of our home's foundation. Then little more than a rectangular patch of concrete. The trees which ringed the clearing were sparse in some places, thicker in others, but even so we could see a lot of the ground beyond the clearing. Grassy, humped ground. Trees, nothing else. The ex-girlfriend had a blanket, which she spread out on the patch of concrete. We lay down together and talked for some space, the while listening to the chirr of the crickets. Dusk had just crept in, and we were still lying there when he heard movement in the woods nearby. The furtive crackle of branches crunching leaves. It was very close, much too close for comfort. From the sound of it, it was no more than 20 yards away. Surely we would have heard its approach from a way off. After all, sound has a tendency to carry in the woods. We got up by mutual, unspoken agreement, and in the dark made our hasty but careful way to the driveway. The sound of something approaching from the woods changed. It was now in the clearing, where he had been only moments before. As shiz scared as ever I've been, I broke into a run, which was immediately arrested by my girlfriend, who urgently whispered, "Don't run, it provokes chase." I did as she bade, and together, in silence, we moved back down the driveway. Moved as fast as we could without actually running. By the time we got to the street, the sounds were gone. "What do you think that was?" I asked her. "I don't want to talk about it," she said, stone-faced. She was 100% Native American. I knew she knew more than she let on, but regardless of how much I pried, she never told me what it was. To this day, I wonder. There's something following me. I decided to reach out finally after seeing something I cannot begin to describe. I made this account to post this and hopefully find some answers. I've lived in Virginia for almost 3 years now and started a graveyard shift job at a gigantic complex which includes original houses from the 80s colonial period. For those who live here, they will be able to identify the exact location in which I'm referring to. I've worked here before, going on a year and a half. I monitor every building and repair any HVAC equipment during the night. Thinking back to my first weird experience at this job, it was when I first stayed during the graveyard shift. I heard an unidentifiable noise. My second month here, around 4 in the morning. I don't scare easily, and I'm a bit of a horror movie buff. It was a very low growl. It sounded as if it was crouching right behind me in my office. I sat there stunned, not turning around, not moving whatsoever. When I got the courage to turn and see what it could be, there was nothing there. I tried to talk to my co-workers about the noise, but since I'm a young guy that does a bit of pranking, no one really took me too seriously. Trust me when I say, I question so much and pick apart horror movies as a hobby. So when I couldn't identify this sound, I blamed it on the shite refrigerator I have in here. It's been well over a year now. I've never once heard that noise again. Recently, I've been leaving early to take a scenic route to get to work, enjoying the fall foliage and the cool breeze. I've been pulling into the same spot for the past couple of weeks to smoke cigs and relax before getting there and clocking in. Last week, when I pulled in and parked, I felt this uneasy feeling of being watched by something or someone in the tree line. I brushed it off the first 2 or 3 times it happened during the rest of the week. Now, this may seem like paranoia, but I know paranoia being a recovering coke addict. I can promise you this isn't some delusion. This is a trust your gut type of paranoia. 3 days ago, I went back to flash some headlights and try to establish some dominance to take back my spot and to get nosy, hoping to see something, if anything at all. When I didn't see anything, I shrugged it off once again and decided to park anyway. No sinking feeling. I started to relax. I put the cig between my lips, cracked my window down about 8 inches, put my car in park and pull out my lighter. As I hit my lighter and lean in to light the cig, I get a cool sensation cover my entire body. The hair on the back of my neck stand up. As I look around the car, I peer into the rear view mirror and see a white shape about 50 feet from the back end of the car. I tap the brake to illuminate the area and see a gangly tall creature with a long white face standing on its back legs, hunched over 5 or 6 feet into the tree line, about 20 feet right behind my car. I took a sharp breath in and about coughed up a lung when I threw my car into drive and sped off. This was only a few days ago. I work by myself on the 2nd floor of a pretty secure building. I keep hearing crunching leaves as if a grown man is walking directly under the window where my office is. This only happens when I'm at work, where I feel it will be a matter of time until I feel its presence at my house as well. The more I read and try to understand what I saw, I couldn't be more convinced that what I saw was a Wendigo. I'm starting to dream about this thing. Last night was the first night it appeared in a dream. Being in Virginia by myself gives me much relief from my family because they aren't in danger. If I even am in danger, sure as heck feels as if I am. Help! What was it really? What really attacked our horses? My sister and I took a ride on our horses a few days ago, and I would say our horses are fairly spook proof. They sit still when we shoot rifles off their backs, so when they get spooked at a tall, dark, twisted figure in the corner of the woods, we flipped out and booked it back to the barn. We rode them straight into the barn, sucking down so we wouldn't get knocked off. They ran straight into their stalls. My sister was in a separate stall opposite me with her horse. We locked the stalls and bolted the doors shut from the inside. This was a feature I never thought we would need. Dead bolts on the inside of a stall and wood windows covers. There was no way inside. I heard it chase us wherever it was had been following us closely through the field. I think we barely escaped. I didn't even notice my horse was bleeding on her left hip. I felt a kick while we were riding away, and I didn't think something had actually got her. She was sweating and I could see the white in her eyes. I stood away from the window and the door. My father must have seen us or it because we heard gunshots coming from the right side of the barn going towards the field. I called out to Sherry asking if she was okay. She was, but her horse was hurt just like mine. She asked if I saw what it was that scared the horses. I told her I barely saw anything. To be honest, I still don't know what it was, but it was thin and dark and smelled rotten. It left claw marks deep in our horse's backsides. They'll have matching scars, but I don't think they'll let us take them back to the woods. They haven't left their stall for 2 days. My dad described it as really mutated and mangled dog. He shot at it when it started to run into the barn. He made it bleed, but we hadn't found the body. To be fair, he was pretty far away from it, so he didn't see it really good. What is it? I've heard of skinwalkers and wendigos, so I thought I'd post my story and ask. We have no clue to this day, but it always comes back at the end of every month without fail and kills our livestock. It hasn't come this close to us before, but now it's become a scary problem. Any help would be appreciated. I hope that soon it should be back and my brothers are going to kill it this time. Wendigo in my shed. So to let you all know, I live in Canada and I've seen drunk people and bears, but what I saw was neither. I had just got in bed and started to doze off, but then I heard something scream. It was like if you were to run a sharp piece of metal on a chalkboard while screaming in a slimy, pitched voice. It scared me so bad I jumped out of bed, shocked. I looked out the window and what I saw was terrifying. I saw the shadow of a head like a deer with antlers and a tall, thin body in my shed. I grabbed a flashlight and pointed it, and this thing, bad idea, when the light hit, it looked at me for about 20 seconds, but it felt like hours. I could make out more of its body now, and it looked so rotten. It looked more like a walking body inside of a working animal, if you would call it that. After a good stare off, it ran back into the forest. All I could see was a blur. I have had more incidents with it, but this was the scariest by far. Incident 2. If you haven't read my post, Wendigo in my shed, then I suggest you read it. Anyways, I had went to my friend's house for a party, and it was actually pretty fun, of course. I didn't drink and I was going to drive myself home. I'm the type of person who doesn't like to waste people's time, so when I go to parties, I don't want to have someone to drive in the snow at 9:30 in the middle of the woods. So I was going to drive myself home. I was about halfway to my house when something jumped in front of my car and on the other side of the road into the forest. But I didn't stop because this thing had antlers, so it could have been a deer. But it had long legs and arms, so that freaked me out enough to just keep on driving home. I got back home safe, but sadly that would not be the last time I saw this thing. Even though I prayed to never see it again, I have. So, I have a few more stories if you guys want to hear them. I do still live in the same house, but I haven't seen it in a few weeks, and I wonder, will I ever see it again? Who wants to hear my Wendigo story? My boyfriend and I get off work at around 10 and 10:30. So we grocery shop at work. Work don't close till midnight. We were headed home and we take the cuts on our way home. We saw a slender but muscular person running naked across the road like an animal on all fours. The more we stared, the less human it looked. Muscular thin legs, hair fur running down its butt down to the calves. It was a curve next to a canal, so as we turned, seen it and our light beam shined on it. Our brights were on, and my light shined on the orchard it ran into. Those trees were leafless and apart, so we were able to see how it ran into the trees. Both my boyfriend and I saw it and both agreed it was no human, no monkey, no other animal, just a crazy creature. I recently told a friend and she told me it was a Wendigo. We live in Central Valley in California. This is one of the weirdest encounters we've ever had. Can't do this anymore. I'm not dead, at least, but I need to kill this thing. It's been tormenting me for months and I'm tired of it. During my search, I saw the same creature I saw before. The thing was crouched down in front of me and it looked like a corpse of a bear. And I saw this, I booked it back to my house. I heard a growl behind me as I ran away. As the snapping of branches and sticks behind me. After I got back, I locked the door and windows and blinds. I was in bed when I heard tapping on the window next to my bed. I really gotta kill or get rid of this thing because I can't do this anymore. It happened again. So I've had a few run-ins with Wendigos as I live in northwestern PA. Tonight, though, I was walking my boyfriend out to his car like I usually do. We heard crunching, even though no one was walking. My dogs were inside and my family was all watching a movie. When we got to his car, I kissed him and started to do our usual goodbye. But we both heard a scream. I kissed him, told him to be safe and ran. Now I know none of y'all know anything about me, but I don't run. Then he called me because I was having a panic attack, and every time I've had an experience with a Wendigo, my chest gets tight and I feel incredibly sick, and I felt that all day today. Early in the day we were at his house and he didn't point this out to me until he called me, but he said he saw it. In his bedroom there's a window about 7 feet off the ground and he said he saw a little bit of grey pale head, I guess. And then as soon as he looked at it, the thing moved. I know this all might sound stupid or not make sense, and I'll answer any questions that are commented. I'm just freaking out. And he told his mum about it and she's freaked out about it too. I had a weird dream about the Wendigo. Okay, so I don't really know where to begin, but we went camping. My grandparents took me and 4 of my friends. We just walk around the house, not thinking much of it, but we keep hearing really weird noises, but we don't do anything about it. Later on in my dream, me and my one friend were playing on the Wii, and then we heard this low growl in the room next to us. So we run outside the house. As we're running, the creature gets a hold of one of my friends and maul him to death. After that, it was over. We all got separated. I was hiding in the kitchen and he walks into the kitchen, staring at me and comes closer. And I start saying, it can't kill me cause it's morning. I don't know why I said this, but it worked. It left me alone, but it stayed in the house with me. I don't know, the creature was sort of being nice, I guess. But then since I was still scared, I told it I was gonna go look for my friends. But I stayed. Instead, I went to barricade myself in a room. And it didn't work. And then I woke up. I don't know if this means anything. I've been reading stories about this, and I'm wondering if anyone can give me an answer to what this might be. And if I dream of this again, is this a bad sign? I also live nowhere near the woods, but my old house that we moved out of 3 weeks ago was 3 blocks away from the forest. And another old house of mine from when I was in second grade had the forest legit behind our house. And I remember there was always a black cat that lives behind there. I don't know if this really means anything. I just thought I'd put it out there. I also had another dream about this 2 weeks ago, but I don't really remember it. When me and my friend talked about the Wendigo that same night I had the first dream. Call me a liar. I had a dream of a Wendigo. It killed almost everyone I know. I can remember it so vividly, and any time I woke up and went back to sleep, the dream would just continue. Once I remembered how to kill it the way we've been told how to. The dream would stop and I'd wake up. Anytime I tried, I'd never finish the job, and the dream would pick back up and start at the point before I killed it. I can't hide from it. Literally, it'll find me anywhere. It was a big sob, very big. The ground boomed when it walked. I can remember a well in the dream too, and the well was connected to a tunnel system. I'll assume this is where it resides. It was about as tall as a common motorhome home, and as big as 2 standard white vans. You could blow up the well because it would relentlessly dig its way out to get you. He was big, red, and had no skin, just exposed muscle. Probably why he was red. My mind told me it was a Wendigo. It still had the trademark antlers and skull. Its hands were large with daggers for claws. They'd challenge a modern blade for sure. I hope I don't have another dream of it. This dream gave me anxiety and sort of dread and paranoia. As for me, I only have a pinky width of Native American. I am a Texas-born man, still in Texas, 19 years old, white. I do fancy listening to stories about it often, and I've even talked about it. I guess I forgot that rule about talking about it. Comments, opinions, tips and other things. Or don't, I just felt I should post this. If I remember anything else important, I'll make a new post with the same title, but with a part 2 on it. I was in prison for 15 years. There was a skinwalker in there with us. A little background first. I was serving a 15-year sentence in a penitentiary in southern Arizona. What I was in there for isn't important. During my stay there were countless things that happened that no one could explain, and even more that no one wanted to know more about. It all started with a prison legend. Supposedly, years ago, something awful and unexplainable happened in the prison. Every morning, we'd be woken up and expected to stand near the front of our cells, while guards visually confirmed we were present and accounted for. Apparently, about a year before I got sent there, the most brutal and unexplainable thing happened during one of these routines. A man who had a cell to himself looked very off during this check. When a guard pulled over another guard to help him check it out, they found it wasn't actually the prisoner they were expecting at all. It was a totally different man. This man was wearing the skin of the other man over him, loosely fitting, draped over him. Apparently looked like a real monster. The scariest things were though was the guy wearing the skin was not an inmate. They had no idea how he even got into prison, let alone a cell. What's worse is that they couldn't even figure out who the hell he was. He wasn't documented anywhere. And what's worse than that, they never even found the body of the man of the skin he was wearing. Pretty grisly stuff, I know. And I realize that's not the go-to definition of a skinwalker, but that's what the prison called him, the Skinwalker. Didn't help that the guy never talked, apparently. Anyway, that's what started the whole Skinwalker superstition around the yard. Apparently the guy got shipped to a different spot about a month after it happened, and just about everyone in Gen Pop felt all the better for it. I heard about the story on the second day of my stay. Hell of a story to hear, to place in your home for the foreseeable future. Now onto the real shiz though. Sure, that guy was the Skinwalker, but all he did in the long run was get an old-lifer Navajo inmate to tell everyone about actual Skinwalkers. It seemed like a lot of the prison culture actually revolved around them. Now apparently Skinwalkers are tricky to point out on the spot, but if you manage to survive around one for more than a minute or two, almost everyone can tell the mannerisms are all off. They can mimic human speech, but not replicate it. They twitch maniacally. They have an unnatural gait while walking. But apparently they got better with the experience. The old Navajo guy, his name was Carl, said that he was sure there was an actual one among the prisoners. Slowly, Pekung was off over the years. He called it the Grand Master Skinwalker at one point. Apparently, he thought it had human mannerisms down so well that you might not even be able to tell if it was your cellmate for a day or two. It had to be good, he poised one night. He would expect a skinwalker to jump at any opportunity for a kill. But this one realized it had a revolving door of people to kill coming to it, and masterfully bided its time, as Carl thought, for years. A lot of guys found humor in it. A lot more were really on edge about it. Every once in a while in prison, people snap. Sometimes you'd find your cellmate swinging in front of your bunk, strung up around the neck by his pant leg. Sometimes you just can't take it anymore. But in our yard, people tended to snap in a very special way. It wouldn't be an outburst as dinner, or a silent suicide in the night. Guys would just stop talking, hunch over, and shuffle around. Any friendship they had would be mostly out the window. They would turn into a loner during rec time. They would let their hair hang in front of their face. No one liked to talk about it. Like if they did, it would happen to them next. I felt the same way. I didn't know if it was a skinwalker or just people going crazy, but I didn't want to find out. It wasn't clockwork or anything, but every time someone snapped in this way, it wasn't more than a couple of weeks before they were shipped off or transferred to God knows where without anyone else knowing beforehand. Then there were the nighttime occurrences. Short, loud bursts of sounds echoed through my cell block during all hours of the night on a regular basis. It sounded like a mix between a pig's dying squeals and nails on a chalkboard. Just another thing no one liked to talk about. Even scarier were the shadows and footsteps. The block was dimly illuminated in the night by a few lights hanging from the ceilings outside the cells. I myself saw shadows flit across my walls on a regular occasion, when there were definitely no guards near my cell. One time, near the end of my sentence, I woke up, looked at my back wall, and found a perfect silhouette of a person standing there, but when I looked, my bunkmate was asleep, and no one was outside my cell. And the footsteps. Everyone hated the footsteps. They were the scariest part. In the night, sometimes, more rarely than the shadows, you would hear ungodly, fast footsteps. They sounded like wet feet slapping on tile floor. Whatever caused them would fly from one end of the block to the other in a dead sprint. Whatever it was inhumanly fast. If you happened to be awake before they started, by the time you heard the footsteps on one side of your cell and whipped your head around to see the thing run by, it sounded like it was 3 cells past you. Everyone hated the footsteps. I agreed. I thought they were the worst. I was released from that place about a month ago, and I have more stories than I can count. I swear it was nearly my turn. About a week before I was discharged, my cellmate and a grunt friend of mine snapped. In the same kind of way. I didn't sleep for an entire week. Well, I did sleep, of course, but never for more than a few minutes at a time. Never turned my back on the guy. The scariest thing? I woke up one night to him somehow snaking his body through the bars of our cell. For reference, I couldn't get anything past my shoulder through them. The worst part though, he was coming back into our cell. On the day of my release, I didn't say a word to him. Just left. He seemed fine with it. So was I. I had made it through 15 years of prison fights, gang disputes, and for all I know, Skinwalker abductions. I left through the front gates, a free man. As I walked along the fence for the rec yard, I spotted my cellmate, standing off on his own, like he had for the last week or so. I shook my head, not even really sure if it was him anymore. I took one last look over the yard, this time from the other side of the fence. I wish I hadn't. There, standing off on his own, on the other side of the yard was Carl, slouched over, eyeing the other inmates, and twitching maniacally. My grandfather saw a skinwalker. My grandfather told me a story once, as we sat around a campfire in his backyard. In the cool night of the Arizona desert, the horizon was clear, and each star twinkled in a purple sky, with a full, fat moon hanging low over the mountains. His voice was raspy and gravelly, the result of a long time of smoking cigars and drinking whiskey. The fire danced and shined across his wide, dark eyes as he settled into his seat, ready to tell his story. Way back when I was a boy about your age, he began, I lived outside an Apache reservation with your great-grandfather. He had returned from the war and set about raising horses and cattle on 100-acre ranch settled between a brambly mountainside, with dirt good for growing thorn brush and not much else. One night, my mother was sick and Pa and I took a trip into town, about 50 miles away, straight through a dry desert, over a washed-out creek, and some old abandoned farmsteads. The fire sparked, and a log cracked, jolting me out of the story. What next? I asked. Settle down, boy. You'll hear soon enough. Pa and I were driving in an old Ford pickup truck. I remember it was dark out, inky and thick, with only the lights of our old truck lighting up the road. I remember too when the engine began to sputter and the truck slowed to a jerky stop. God damn it, Pa said. guiding the four to the side of the road. As it coasted to a halt, "Stay here, son," as he stepped out into the darkness, shutting the door with a heavy thud. My window was down, and the cool desert air was breezy and felt good on my hot face and neck. Pa was getting water from the back to cool the engine, and that's when I smelled it. Rotten eggs. Ugh. Strange, I thought, to smell sulfur in the desert. My nose also picked up carrion, like one of them dead bloated cattle that would drop from the heat and lay there until the crocs pecked enough holes in their hide to cause the whole thing to explode. It stunk and I gagged. My skin started to tingle too. The back of my neck felt itchy and my face started to get hot. The wind started blowing. It stopped and hung still and heavy, with the stink filling the cab. "Pa," I called. "Pa, Pa." No answer. My heart started beating, and I felt such a fear in me, in my bones, in my chest, boy. I tell you, I never felt fear like this. Not until Vietnam. Not until I saw men dying around me. I locked the door and reached over for my pa's door and saw a shadow bound across the road through broad dim beams of light, across the partly open domed hood. Grandfather paused. He spit a fat wad of tobacco spit off his side, and he looked pensively into the darkness. I realized I was holding my breath and gasped for air. The night was cool, but I was sweating and clammy. "Well, what happened? What about your father? What did you see?" He sighed. "A creature." He shook his head. "You have to understand, there were legends, all legends, older than the rock kinds out in the valley, older still than Crazy Horse Sitting Buck, than the old Indian chiefs and their shamans, the Apache and Hope and Cherokee, and all them old tribes and First Peoples. They told tales, old stories about dark ancient magic, a deal made with the old spirits of blood sacrifice, to gain power, all power, enough to fight each other and the Spaniards. And later, the white men that came for their land and women, they called them." He paused. Grandfather took a deep breath and bodied forward into his tale. "Across the fire and the sky, the desert, the creek, the moon, the sun, and all mountains." He bodied forward. "They called them Skinwalkers, shape angels, all warriors resurrected as skinless men, all sinew and muscle, walking on deer legs with the torso of a man and the head of a coyote, but messed up boy, long and malformed snouts, teeth like a bowie knife, long arms and standing 7 foot, even hunched over. They'd gut the old cowboys and white riders. They'd run through bullets and sabers, part the Spanish armor like it was a potato sack. Wily too. They could change their voices to match a person you knew or might know. Boy, that's what I saw. Big and fast. Only for a second, it ran across the road, grey and mottled, muscle flexing under its legs, hooves clumping on the road, stringly muscle hunched shoulders, and it turned. Looked right into the cab, looked right into my eyes, and I swear, boy, I swear it grinned at me. I sank into my seat in shock, in fear, shaking. I knew death was near. The air was electric. I smelled ozone and brimstone. The air felt like right before the lightning comes and blows the tree to smithereens, charged and full with power. I yelled for my paw, but no words came out, just a dry squeak. I was shaking as grandfather told his story. He was still here, so I know he lived, but the supernatural always fascinated me. And even now, I felt the force of his words. The real power of skinwalkers was trickery. Sure, they could change their voices, but also their skin. That's why the gods took their hide, so they could take others. Not for long, the legend says. Maybe an hour before the soul of the skin they wore would come looking for their mortal shell before going to whatever hell awaited them. Though I think that getting skinned alive was hell enough. A minute passed in what felt like a lifetime, 1 second in 1,000 years. My father's door opened, and I jerked my head to the left, putting my fists up to fend off attack. "Son, it's me," my father said, before climbing into the cab. He grasped the steering wheel and pulled himself in awkwardly, jerking himself into the seat. I cringed into the corner. I looked at him. I looked hard. "Boy, your great-grandfather was a good man. Treated me and my ma right. He fought the Nazis and saw the worst of man in Poland when he freed all them camps. And now I was taking his measure. Is this my father? Do I make a run or do I die? Is it him or not? Let's go get that medicine for your mom." As he pulled the truck into gear and pulled it out to the road, and our trip resumed. I guess it was him after all. "But how do you know? Was it because he said something about your mom?" "No, boy. Because out the window, out the corner of my eye, I seen that beast running 50 miles an hour right next to the car, looking at me with them yellow eyes and grinning mouth. I looked and saw it, hunched and angry, running next to us, boy. My pa kept his eyes on the road, looked straight forward. 'Son,' he said, 'don't look at it. Don't look at it.' That's how I knew, boy." This is my father's story, written from his perspective. It follows an experience he had with a skinwalker on the Navajo reservation. When I was about 11 or 12, we lived in a small house made of mud and snow, a lot like our house now. It was 2 of my brothers and I in the house. Everyone else had gone to the Jamet's feast and left us to tend the sheep. We were getting ready for bed when we heard the dogs going crazy outside. Thinking it was nothing more than coyotes howling in the distance, we told them to be quiet. We began to drift off into sleep, and the dogs would not shut up. Somehow, I was able to go to sleep for a few hours. Then I woke up very late in the night. It was very quiet and still in the house, save for my brother snoring and breathing. I realized I needed to use the outhouse and woke up my brother to take me there. He teased me about being scared, which I certainly was. We went out with our flashlight to the outhouse. The dogs began with their crazed barking out in the sagebrush, going from one place to the next. My brother went first, and I waited outside for him. While waiting, I tried to follow the dogs with my flashlight. Suddenly, there was a very loud whine from one of the dogs. Then everything went quiet again. It was really too quiet for that time of year. Not even the sheep were making noise. Suddenly, I heard a few of the dogs going completely mad by the truck. When I looked over, there was this man. He was unbelievably tall, leaning one arm on the cab roof of the truck. He was looking at the dogs for a little, and then suddenly kicking one of them. They all scattered in different directions. The thing looked up at me, and I saw its face. It had a pure white face like a full moon, two burning red eyes, and a slight smile that was pure black. I could not move or make a sound. It began to walk towards me with long strides, until it finally towered over me. All I began to see was a dark red, like the color of the blood when you cut the throat of a sheep. I kept getting deeper and deeper into its eyes. I could faintly hear my brother coming out of the outhouse with this. The thing looked up at him. Reality came rushing back to me. I noticed that my brother was too distracted with his buckle to realize what was going on. I also noted this thing's long hands hovering just inches from my head. Its skin was black ash, and it smelled like a bloated dead animal in summer. I was still unable to move or speak. The Skinwalker began to move towards my brother. Finally noticing this figure, my brother became paralyzed as I was. Closer and closer it drew, reaching an arm out towards my brother's head. Something finally snapped in me. I became unbearably angry. I broke from the trance and lunged at the Skinwalker, raising my arms like a wild animal and baring my teeth at it. A growl came out that I never knew I could make. I became more and more angry at the time that was trying to hurt us. It kept that smile at first, but the angrier I got, the more the smile faded. Finally, with everything I had, I began to make this primal roar at it. It fell backwards and ran away into the night, looking back at me. Its eyes were dim and dull. Its smile now long since gone. The next morning, the family returned home from the feast. After relaying the story to my parents, they quickly hired a medicine man. I just bought a home on the Ohio-Michigan border. It is in the middle of the woods. I only own about 5 acres, but it is surrounded by over 600 acres of woodland. There is only one other house nearby. I've noticed a few strange things and had a few strange things happen recently. I will explain in detail. I'm worried about the possibility of a Wendigo or Skinwalker, but I am not knowledgeable on the subject and would like to learn as much as possible to protect my family. The red flags. An older single woman sold us the home. Her daughter and son-in-law were helping her sell it by the owner. Many times the daughter mentioned about how her mother was paranoid living there. She had lived there for over 20 years, but now never leaves the home, even though she is in good health. She said she would never answer the door whenever someone knocked, and there are cameras outside. There is also a flashlight in every room. They accepted our offer of about 60,000 under asking price. We loved the property and told them that, but couldn't afford what they were asking. They met us where we could afford it. During the home inspection, the inspector tried opening a window and it was stuck shut. He went to try another and the homeowner stated, "None of the windows open. They haven't in years." I didn't think anything of it and just assumed they were old and broken. The home was built in 1985
and had original windows. The inspector also found some issues with the exterior of the house. There appeared to be a lack of maintenance outside. Once again, the family stated that the homeowner just didn't like to be outside anymore and spent all her time inside. I met with the homeowner at her house again so I could gather some measurements. While I was there, she showed me how a few things in the home work. She made it a point to show me a light on a pole outside. She said, "If that light ever goes out, replace it immediately. It is way too dark out there without it." She has also stated that at night we will hear coyotes right up against the house, as they like to gather by a bush near the front porch in the winter. A co-worker of mine has lived in the woods 2 counties over for years. He just went through a rough divorce and was forced to sell his house. He just gifted me an axis deer skull with antlers. He said it was gifted to him when he bought his property and he kept it by his front door. He now wants me to have it and suggested I hang it up outside. I'm a hunter and I thought it was cool and never thought more of it until now. My fiancée and I have both been having nightmares, not about a Wendigo, but my nightmare is about my newborn son getting possessed by something. I've had the dream a few times. My fiancée won't tell me about her dream. We haven't taken possession yet, but we will on November the 6th. I'm concerned something is going on with the property. I want to know if you all think I have anything to worry about. If you think I do, what can I do? Update from help: I bought a home with property and something isn't right. We have been living at the new house for 13 days now. We have taken some of your recommendations of cleansing the home to get any bad vibes out, and things have been great. But there's a creepy pattern happening. For the third time, I just found bones just outside our door. This time, it was what appears to be a deer femur head. This was found outside of the door that leads to the back deck. A few nights ago, there was a pile of smaller bones by the door leading to the front porch. And one of the first few nights we moved in, there was a long bone by the rear door, right by where I just found the femur head. I didn't think anything of it the first 2 times, assuming the long bone was left out there by the previous owner, and I chalked up the pile of bones to an animal. But it's weird that it's happened 3 times now, and each time by a door. Is this something to be worried about? The only other strange things happening are I cannot get the motion lights to work outside. They were already installed. I changed the bulbs twice now in them, and they worked when I went inside. Next night they did not. So far, I'm just chalking this up to bad wiring. A few times we have heard a very strange sound outside coming from the woods. I'm an avid hunter and do a lot of camping and have never heard it before. It sounds like a loud propeller chopping through the woods. Possibly sounds elevated off the ground, but it's hard to tell. After it passes though, the woods go crazy. It wakes everything up. We see deers running around after, can hear coyotes howl. It takes a few minutes for everything to settle back down. Do either of these things sound like I'm dealing with something out of my league? I'm sorry for the dumb questions and stories, but there's just something about this property that makes me worried. Thank you.
When I was about 10,
my family wanted to drive cross country through the Southwest, visiting places throughout Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. We stopped for a night at a cheap cabin. I don't remember the exact location, but I remember it being somewhere between Alamogordo and Roswell. The area around it was very densely wooded, and it was about 20 minutes from a small gas station where we got food for the night. It was a 2-bedroom cabin with a living room, and my parents took the big room. My younger sister got the other bedroom, and I was on a pull-out couch. The couch was placed directly next to a large window, looking out at a creek leading into the woods. The day went by, and everyone went to sleep. I woke up around 2 in the morning to a knocking on the window. I was facing away from it and was too scared to turn around. It wasn't a random knocking either. It was rhythmic, like a waltz with long pauses. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Too terrified to move, I lied there, trying not to make a noise, until whatever was out there started to make a quiet, shrill, high-pitched whistle. When I heard that, I started screaming for my father, and the knocking abruptly stopped. And my dad ran into the room. He's not a superstitious man, and says to this day that he didn't see anything. But according to him, the sense of malice that hit him was unlike anything he ever felt before. He got my sister, and we all slept together in a big bedroom. The next day, I looked at the ground outside the window and saw a large deer track leading directly up to it. We have done similar trips until I moved out, for my dad refused to go back to that area. I saw some videos about skinwalkers on TikTok, so I started watching videos about them on YouTube, and there was a whole podcast where this guy just read stories about them from Reddit and other stories that people submitted. Well, our ward at church purchased a piece of land way back in the day. It's seriously just wooded area with a little bit of swamp. Anyways, we would always go there for campouts and scouts, and at night, when it was pitch black, we would all play manhunt. Well, one time, we all got down to one person whose name was David. Growing up, he was super fast, and he would hide really good so nobody could ever find him. He would always end up being the last person. Well, one time it was down to David, and we had split up and gone way deep into the forest towards the swamp because it seemed like it was impossible to find him. We thought he might have gone a little bit further than we usually go. We started getting into some more muddy and wet terrain as we get closer to the swamp-like area where the water is probably shin deep, and we saw David way out in the swamp, and he wasn't wearing any shirt, and with the spotlight on him he looked super pale, but he just stood there and didn't say a word. You could seriously tell something was off. Then all of a sudden we heard David from behind us yelling, trying to get our attention, so we would keep trying to chase him down. Meaning, what we saw in front of us was definitely not him. So being a bunch of 12 to 17-year-old boys, we started yelling and running back to the campsite as fast as we could. Nobody believed us. In fact, for years everybody made fun of it, calling the ghost of David. But then I started listening to these stories, and every single one of them sounds just like what happened in some way or another. I'm going to preface this by saying this is a long read, but it's worth it. My friend and I were chatting about this creepy experience we had, and I'm finally trying to get to the bottom of it. So I figured I'd turn to Reddit for some answers, if there are any. People will probably think this is fake, but I don't care. Believe it or don't. I have no clue if this animal creature is a skinwalker or just a very creepy animal. This took place around 2019, and I do live in Tennessee, right on the outskirts of the Appalachian Mountains. So here goes. Two of my friends and I were driving on a desolate back road at night. We were jamming to music and talking. Everything was normal. I was driving, my friend Hannah was in the passenger seat, and our friend Chris was in the back seat behind me. Hannah was trying to pull up a song on YouTube that wasn't on Spotify, so it was silent for a bit while she was waiting on the website to load. But Chris and I were still talking. We came up on a small animal in the road, but I didn't think anything of it. Well, I expected the animal to move pretty quickly once it saw us coming down the road, but it didn't. As I got closer, I slowed down to let the animal have enough time to run off, but it still stayed very still. It almost looked frozen. The closer I got, I could make out that it looked like some kind of cat. The only thing was, it didn't look like any sort of cat I've ever seen. It looked like it had fur, but the fur was flesh colored. Its ears were very small, almost like a kitten's, even though it was only a tiny bit bigger than an adult house cat. It was laying in a way that looked like a phoenix, facing us. The scariest thing about it though was its eyes. Not to sound over dramatic, but its eyes literally looked like the pits of hell were burning inside of them. They were reddish orangish and had twinkles of yellow in them that reflected off the headlights. The whole car was silent, and I just stared ahead. This cat scared the living daylights out of me, and it still wasn't moving. I felt a huge pit in my stomach and began having intense anxiety. It was almost like I was frozen, but I was not about to stop to figure out what this cat was. At this point, I had to steer around a bit to pass it without hitting it. I was probably 3 inches away from touching this thing, and as I slowly crept by it, I watched it through the window the entire time. It did not flinch, and the eyes still had that same glow even without my headlights directly on it. After we passed it, about 5 seconds later, Chris yells, "What the heck was that?" I immediately start freaking out, shouting, "I don't know!" Hannah looks up from her phone and says panically, "What? What did you all see?" She looked behind us and kept asking. We explained what happened, and she said, "I didn't see anything behind us." Chris and I looked back, and sure enough, it was gone. We drove up the road to a church and turned around in the parking lot. We wanted to get back to Hannah's as soon as possible. When we got back, we rushed in and told her mum what we saw, but we didn't mention that it looked like a cat. We described it as a small animal. Her mother stops for a minute and says, "Was it a cat?" We were blown away. We told her that it was, and she said that her and her cousin came across the same exact thing when they were teens, only it was in a different area, and they saw it peeking out of the bushes. She still, to this day, doesn't know what it was, and she said that she thinks about it from time to time, even after 30 years. So I guess I want to know a few things. What was this thing? It didn't look like a bobcat, mountain lion, or fox. Is it a demon, skinwalker, wendigo? An unknown Appalachian creature? I've heard all of the legends regarding the woods at night. Don't look in the trees, don't respond if your mother calls your name, etc. But everyone I've told either tells me it was probably a scared bobcat or that they've never heard of that before. So if anyone made it this far and has some answers, I would gladly appreciate them. Okay, so Friday 1:20 a.m. Me and my friends decide to go for a drive. We sometimes like to go to the Llano mountains near El Cerro to experience something that only happens in that area, paranormal and supernatural. Like any other time we do this, we go in my car and drive past Tom Hill, going towards the mountains and park across from VHS about a mile and a half away. Then we sit and take in the scenic beauty of the dark desert, starting by listening close to anything and looking everywhere, being hyper observant. At first we saw a light in the distance traveling flat on the desert land, getting within about a mile away from us, then disappearing altogether. Moving on from there, we had, and I mean had to see something else. Driving through roads and flying by at least 30 miles per hour over the speed limit, we turned down a familiar road. This is where we knew that something was about to change me and everyone else, including me, 4 people in total, looked to the right side of the car. Saw what we all believed to be something like a hellhound or maybe a skinwalker. A massive black dog just launched at my car while I was going 45 through the road. We should have felt impact from the massive creature, who didn't. Both people in the back seat looked and saw this thing rise up from the ground and stand straight up on 2 legs, absolutely huge and all black with red eyes that are forever imprinted in our minds. I didn't slow down, but sped up, going about 55 miles per hour now. So probably about 20 yards away, they saw it rise up as if nothing happened to it. To start this story off and to give a little insight about me, I am an 18-year-old female who grew up in Michigan and have lived in this country for as long as I can remember. And for heads up, this is a long story, so bear with me. Now back to the story. On one particular hot summer weekend, me and a couple of friends, including my boyfriend, let's call him Tony, and my older brother, let's call him Brad, decided we were going to go camping for the weekend since it was such a nice warm week. Tony's parents had owned a cabin way out in Ludington, surrounded by a huge wooded area with a personal lake and no neighbors for at least 4 miles. But being stupid teenagers, we didn't really think about that. All we were ready for was to party like any normal teen would. Well, after being there for 2 hours, our fun had started. Tony's friends had brought tons of alcohol and weed to last us for the weekend, so we wouldn't be bored since we had no service and only movies to watch. After about 12 a.m, it was pitch black. We had a huge bonfire going. It was a total of 6 people, including me and Tony. As we talked and laughed about upcoming events in our lives, we were so distracted that we didn't notice that my brother had literally frozen his eyes on one section of the woods. Mind you, we were all intoxicated and high at that time. Eventually, our talking ceased when Tony realized his friend and my brother had an emotionless expression. "Hey dude, you alright?" he asked Brad. Silence. Brad didn't reply or even make any movements that would indicate he heard him. After that, I started to get scared as well. As the other 2 girls there, it took a lot for my brother to act that way. Eventually, I was the first to catch on that he was excessively staring into a certain spot in the woods. I turned my head and followed his gaze the best I could. And when I finally caught on to what he was staring at, my heart dropped. Right there, was at first look, it looked like a dog. At least that's what I thought. It was some person's dog that wandered off, is what I thought. But then my brain kicked in and I realized there wasn't neighbors for miles. So how could there be a dog? My mind started to race for a while. Tony still tried to get Brad to speak or even move. In one motion, this thing stood up tall. And when I say tall, I mean bloody gigantic. It had to be at least 6 feet tall. Everyone saw it. How could you not? The other two girls and the other boy with us gasped as they finally grasped why my brother was as still as a stick. No one moved for what seemed like hours. Tony was the first to talk. "No tail," he mumbled. No one heard what he said but Brad. And I swear to you when I say his eyes widened as big as pan saucers. That freaked me out immediately. "What did you say?" one of the girls asked. "It has no tail," he hissed back. My heartbeat stopped. He was right. There was no tail on this thing. Suddenly my clouded alcohol mind cleared up in a fraction of a second when I finally realized what this thing was. Now I understood why my brother was basically scared. This thing was a skinwalker. My instincts kicked in right then and there, but before I could nope the F out there, the thing let off a terrible stench like rotting meat before screaming inhumanely. The sound was enough to scare out everyone. My brother was the first up out of his chair and started shouting native words to the creature while I told everyone to get inside. No one questioned me when they seen just how dead serious I was, especially Tony. He's never seen me so scared, so he knew it was a bad situation. We all hightailed it into the cabin with my brother in tow, still shouting native words at this creature. We seemed to keep it at bay, while it gave us enough time to get inside. He slammed and locked the door before turning all the lights off, and grabbed a special ash from the kitchen counters and started throwing it at every window and door while chanting. Of course, he had everyone freaked out and basically in tears at that moment. After he was done, no one said a word for a long time. All of us still in shock. He grabbed out that pistol and had it posted by him for hours. Everyone was entirely too shaken up to even question what happened. He must have fallen asleep eventually because I woke up to my brother packing all our stuff into the 2 cars early in the morning. I understand why. We had native family, we knew what we were dealing with, and we knew it would come back, and maybe not alone. Before we left, I did a blessing on the cabin and spoke a few calming words to the still very freaked out girls. We left as soon as everything was packed up. To this day, we still haven't explained exactly what happened to our friends that night, and they never bothered to ask us either. Father and uncle have a story of living as outsiders, non-native Caucasian, young people on the reservation. Their tale of experiencing a skinwalker. My grandma taught school on the reservation and they lived well off compared to the natives living there. From what I know, there's a lot of law surrounding the Navajo Nation. Non-natives, primarily older generations, keeping their experiences and stories left unspoken, especially to those not from the culture. Forgive me if I'm mistaken in any of this. The culture, ideology, practices, or any other part. I'm just trying to tell the story my family has only spoken to me in whispers about. My grandmother, father, and uncle lived there for a few years, and their experience was much different than the Navajo people who have lived there for generations upon generations. I just want to tell their story and get insight as to anyone else who has lived in that community and any other stories some people might be willing to share. My father and uncle are about 2 years apart in age. They lived in Navajo Mountain in the 1980s. My dad was 10 to 12 and my uncle was younger. As it goes, they were always outside, riding bikes with their friends, natives of the reservation. My grandma was recovering from an abusive relationship with their father and wasn't too concerned with their whereabouts, being it was a small community. There wasn't much trouble around, nor would they know what real trouble was at that age. Trouble wasn't the issue to young white boys on a reservation then. Pure terror was. It was a typical night without any parental supervision. The night was colder than usual and the night sky was blacker than you could imagine. In such a desolate place, the stars in the sky would light the night. This night was as if the earth had moved to a different dimension, an abyss. The boys raced each other as they did every night, until they were compelled to force their brakes in unison. They simultaneously looked up. Each boy's face melted from carefree, innocent, and adolescent to unadulterated horror. The boys stood motionless, grasping their bikes with every nerve, muscle, and strength in their body on the dirt road. To the right of them was a mesa, one they rode by every day. The mesa that paralleled from my family's home, the mesa that they could see through my father and uncle's bedroom every night. The mesa would become fear and nightmares to them from this night forward. At the top of the mesa was a roaring fire, taller than any bonfire that someone could assemble, bigger than a group of people could assemble. It raged and was unbelievable. It was almost as tall as the mesa itself. More unbelievable was a pitch black figure seen cavorting around a bonfire. The native boys with my father and uncle informed them that this was not a typical Navajo dancer or ritual. Pits began to form in their stomachs. Friends of my father and uncle turned back around without a word and bolted back to their homes. My father and uncle threw their bags to the ground and ran across the unpaved road into their home. The two came back in a panic, relaying what they'd seen to my grandmother, but she was unconcerned. A legend of the natives, she told them, and shooed them away. They laid awake all night in their shared room, not saying a word to one another. They forced their curtains as close as possible, too scared to look out the window and see what they shouldn't have to begin with. Neither could shake the image burned into their memory, but the sun managed to rise and peek through into their room. A sense of release washed over them as the darkness had faded. The boys left their beds and traveled to the kitchen to try a second time to tell my grandmother what they saw that night. They tried to get a handle on what they saw, but it was as if they couldn't explain it. Again, my grandmother brushed them off with a coffee and newspaper more important than their story. She told them to climb the mesa and investigate. The boys wrangled the friends who shared the experience with the night prior as they passed on their bikes. The friends stayed on the dirt road, looking up at the mesa as my father and uncle climbed up to see any evidence of the hell-burning fire they witnessed together. The mesa wasn't much taller than an average one-story house, so the brothers took less than 2 minutes to climb to the top where the nightmare took place. When they got to the top, they were hysterical and also relieved. There was no indication a bonfire of that enormity or even a fire at all had taken place on the mesa they had clearly seen the night earlier. They climbed down and told the message to their friends who had also been a part of the shocking scene. Their native friends looked at them in shock, but neither said a word to them. They immediately turned their backs around and proceeded home. It was never talked about again, despite my father and brother asking about it. My grandmother and everyone else in the community refused to talk about it again. My father is a skeptic. He does not believe in anything paranormal. Aliens, ghosts, mermaids, you name it. But whenever I ask about the skinwalker he saw, he turns pale and white. He gets quiet, jumpy and curt. I had to plead to get the full story out of him, and I could see goosebumps and every hair standing up on his arm when he shared his experience. My grandma took me to Navajo Mountain in 2019 to show me her history and to see how Navajo natives still live on this reservation today. According to her, not much has changed since living there in the 80s. I hiked and explored what I could of the reservation as to not invade or violate any of the Navajo reservation and its beauty. However, I did feel a change in mood when I visited. My existence felt heavy, as if I wasn't supposed to be there, or if I was invading on territory that wasn't meant for me. Not caused by any of the community there, but just by my presence being on the land. I will never forget my experience visiting and all that I learned about reservation life. My intention is to hear any other stories from Navajo Mountain residents or talk with some people with similar stories in the Navajo reservation. I climbed the mesa where the skinwalker my dad and uncle claimed had its ritual. I felt pretty normal until I got to the top and stood in the middle. I felt some darkness creep into me as I stood there. I've never been the same since. When I was around 10 or 12, roughly 12 years ago, me and my grandma and uncle went to Jasper in Canada. Given how I was born in Canada itself, nothing weirded me out when it came to the woods and nature as a whole. I've seen and heard deer before and a whole slew of animals. I don't remember much from the trip other than a bits and pieces, but what I do remember was arriving at the hotel and climbing up the steps to the second floor. The hotel had a parking lot in front before the road. I remember waking up one morning in the hotel while my grandma and uncle were still asleep and walking over to the window to peer out from behind the blinds to see a fox standing in the middle of the road. It looked like it had been run over, given how oddly it was shaped. Concerned for its safety, I wanted to wake up my grandma or simply run out there to check on it. I felt my stomach sink when it turned to face me. Its head looked bruised and misshapen, which I would have ruled out as it having been run over had it not stood on its hind legs. I turned my head away from the window and yelled for my grandma to wake up, who slept in a bed just a couple feet away, before I looked back and saw it walk on those hind legs to the side where the building hid my view from the rest of the road. I looked completely insane when my grandma moved me aside and saw nothing on the road, even going as far as to open the door and peer down both ends of the walkway. Nothing. Regardless, I can say with confidence, I'm not going back to Casper. I don't know if this belongs here, but I feel like it bears mentioning. I, 25 at the time, female, experienced what I can only imagine is an otherworldly occurrence when I first moved to the Sierra Nevadas. about 4 years ago. I had been living in South Lake Tahoe, CA, for years and spent a decent amount of time outdoors, hiking, camping, and just generally enjoying the beautiful place I was lucky enough to call home. Now, I don't scare easy. I'm used to being by myself, and I carry weapons with me everywhere I go. Being a 5'2" and 110-pound female, I go out of my way to be sure I can protect myself. There were many people in the outdoor community who told me to be careful on trails and in the forest. I usually do these things alone, save for my trustworthy, though somewhat cowardly dog. But I never felt as uncomfortable, confused, and downright afraid as I did in my own apartment one night when I finally relocated away from Tahoe to the city of Reno, Nevada. I had moved to Reno to get away from the isolation of living in Lake Tahoe, and though it is only about 60 miles away, it felt like a different world. Now, the city itself isn't huge, and I was living in the north end of town, which is surrounded by high desert foothills and is somewhat sparsely populated compared to the more urban city center. But I never felt as if I was out in the boonies or anything of the sort. I lived alone with my pup, and we liked our little apartment. So to set the scene here, it was early fall. The sun was beginning to set at a much earlier time of day, which was exemplified by the fact that the city sits in a valley, so sunset seems to approach much faster than in other places in northern Nevada. My apartment sat above street level, with a window in the kitchen next to my stacked washer and dryer that looked out into an alley, maybe about 10 feet above the small street that went beside the small fourplex building. It was dark outside, and I was alone with my dog doing laundry. My apartment layout was an open concept. The living room kitchen area was separated by a wall which had a huge space cut off into it that you could see through to each room. The washer and dryer tucked around one corner, and the aforementioned window was to the left of that. With the openness of the space, the darkness outside, and the amount of overall windows the apartment had, if it was dark outside and I had lights on, it looked like I was living in a fishbowl. Anyone or anything could see right in. I made it a point to always close my blinds because of this, save the small window looking out the alley. I didn't mind keeping those blinds open because I liked the fresh air, and someone would essentially need a ladder to reach me had they been determined enough. As I was removing clothes from the dryer and turning to plop it onto my couch to begin folding, I realized my dog was acting incredibly strange. He didn't want to cross over the line from the living room to the kitchen, which was marked by a change from carpet to tile. There was only a few steps. He seemed incredibly hesitant and began whining and burping out small concerned woofs. At first, I just thought he was anxious for whatever reason. He is known to be a bit of a weenie. But then, out of nowhere, I sensed this immense and insatiable feeling of dread and displacement. I had my back turned to the washer and dryer, and the small alley facing window. My dog sat facing me, almost looking past me, and his clear anxiety and frustration began to build as I was asking him what was wrong. He began barking, a full alarm bark at this point, and as soon as he did, the sense that someone or something was observing me took me over and caused my blood to run cold. My logical response was, someone must be watching me through that window, the only window that has open blinds, the only window anyone could possibly see me through. So in one fell swoop, I reached for the overhead drawstring for the light and turned it off and faced the window to confront whoever or whatever was intruding on my life. As soon as the light kicked off and the room was dark, I saw what I can only describe as a perfectly round light, about the size of a small cantaloupe, directly across from me on the other side of the window. It didn't glow like a lamp or light though, its edges were perfect, and it did not hover, nor vibrate, nor move at all. At this point, I was too stunned to move, and my fight, flight, or freeze response had engaged so quickly I had no time to really recognize or rationalize what I was seeing. I was looking at this thing, and it was looking back. I felt cold, confused, my hair standing on end, my heart racing. My dog had gone into full freak-out mode and was jumping and barking and generally causing a ruckus in the living room, as he could see this all. The light seemed now to realize that I was able to see it, and it looked as if it backed away, or at least grew smaller in size and moved to the right of the window. It flickered twice and then disappeared. It didn't buzz away or fly away. It didn't zoom out of vision. It was visible, not visible, visible, and then gone. As soon as I realized the light wasn't there anymore, I opened the window fully and poked my head out to see what was going on. Maybe someone was up at my window with a flashlight. Maybe someone in the neighboring buildings had seen something and would be out checking for themselves to try and solve this odd mystery. Nothing. Not a soul. And what felt like deafening silence, I closed the window. As soon as I shut the window, I heard a solid 3 knocks on the large window by the front door of the living room. As mentioned before, those blinds were closed, and though from the outside looking in it's likely clear someone is home because the lights were on in that room, no one could possibly know it's me, alone, in my apartment, right? I wasn't expecting anyone over. It was too late for solicitors. No one had any reason to be at my house at that time, and I wasn't going to open that door. My dog had rushed to the kitchen as soon as the light outside the window had disappeared, and he was in what I can only call full defense mode. Now, my dog is an absolute wuss. I've seen him run away from cats, get spooked by bags blowing in the street, and he generally stays right by my side on hikes and while camping to protect me. This pup seemed ready for war, hackles up, eyes alert, growling at the front window now. I stepped into the living room, grabbed my gun with one hand, keys with the other, and slinked back to the kitchen and out the back door to where my car was parked. I threw the dog in, started up and raced up to a restaurant across town where I ordered to-go food and ate in the front of the seat of my Subaru. We car camped in a Walmart parking lot that night. I returned to the apartment the following day. My laundry is still on the couch. No apparent signs of anyone trying to enter the place. Everything seemed normal. I never experienced any disruption in that place again for the 1.5 years I lived there afterwards. I have no idea to this day what I experienced, and it wasn't until I shared this story that I heard the knocking and sense of being observed was a somewhat common phenomenon that people relate to encounters with skinwalkers. I don't know what happened that night, but I'd mark myself incredibly lucky if I never had to experience something like that again.
Never shoot a skinwalker. My 2 buddies and I went on a hunting trip for bull elk last November, and we were having a great time, to say the least. That, however, would change after what we saw on the 3rd day. Now, I'm not one for superstition, and I don't believe in ghosts at all. But what we saw out there really changed my view about those sort of things. The trip started out normally. After we parked our trailers at camp, we got there a day early before the hunt officially started, so we could settle in and get some scouting done. Only Eric and I had licenses because Brian didn't draw out this year. but he wanted to come along with us anyway. Brian also brought along his German Shepherd named Lucy. We stayed back at camp with a leash that was connected to a metal spike. The spike was so deep in the ground that I wondered if we would be able to get it out. I asked Brian, and he just told me that his dog was so strong that it had to be that deep. I enjoyed playing with Lucy. She was always excited to see me and would greet me by jumping up on two legs and trying to lick my face. Eric, however, was not amused by her and would constantly yell at her to leave him alone. Anyway, the first 2 days we saw so many cow elk in valleys and on sides of the mountains that I thought for sure we would see some bulls out there, but there were none among them. It wasn't until the third day of the hunt that we saw a bull elk, but it was too far away to take a shot at, and even if we were able to hit it, it would take hours trying to pack that thing out. So that evening we decided to hunker down next to some fallen trees and were able to watch a hillside. While we were surveying the area, Brian spotted a coyote about 250 yards, walking to a small pond of water, strangely as if it was maimed. Eric took out his binoculars to take a closer look, and he started to describe it, saying, "That coyote, it ain't right looking. It has a hunch on its back like a bear. And its jaw, oh man, its damn jaw seems like it's been broken, and now it's just dropping there like a dead fish." "Let me see these binocs," I asked, curiously, with an outstretched hand. Eric handed them to me, and as he did, he seemed to grasp his gun tightly. I took them and looked at the animal and said, "You're right, that thing's jaw is just hanging there. Also, did you happen to notice its hair? It's so long and unevenly dispersed." I then handed the binoculars to Brian, and he looked at the coyote for 1 second and screamed. "Shh! Brian, shut up! We're hunting!" Eric whispered harshly. "What did you see?" I asked as I looked at his shocked facial expression. Brian looked at his feet and he muttered, I saw my dog Lucy, but it wasn't her. I don't know what that was." "It couldn't have been your dog. When I looked at it, it looked like a dying coyote. It didn't have the large black spot on its back, or your dog's strawberry red sides and underbelly," I said in a plain yet confused manner. "Well, since we ain't gonna see anything out here, 'cause you screamed like a baby, I'm going to put that coyote out of his misery," Egg said angrily as he raised his rifle and looked through the scope. A large shot followed, and we saw the animal drop down soon after. It was a clean kill, and Eric was curious about seeing what was wrong with the animal up close, so he started getting ready to hike out. As he got his stuff together, he said, "You probably just didn't get a good look at it, Brian. Your dog is fine." Brian stood up as he brushed the dirt off his butt. He replied, "I swear I saw my dog, but an evil, demented version of it with human eyes. But you guys are probably right. There's no way she could have had the strength to yank out the metal stake holding her back at camp." "Well, let's go find out the truth about this animal," I said, somewhat excitedly, as I started walking toward the dead animal. It took us about half an hour to hike over to it, and we lost sight of the animal's corpse as we had to pass through some trees. Once we finally got to the spot where the animal had dropped, there was no corpse, just a pool of blood. However, the blood was blackish and very dense. Eric observed the scene and started to scratch his head as he said, "I could have sworn I shot that thing straight through its heart. There's no way it could have just gotten back up and walked off." I had an eerie feeling about the whole situation. and Brian was still afraid that it might have been his dog that got shot. Eric, however, noticed a trail of blood leading into a dark tree line. Without asking, he started to follow it, and he loaded his gun. As he did, me and Brian were both freaked out and just watched Eric as he went into the forest. He soon went out of sight, and Brian and I could not leave him. So we waited for him. I passed the time by taking a skinny stick and poking at the puddle of blood. It smelled terrible, and the aroma hit me pretty hard, so much that my stomach convulsed and I threw up. "You okay?" Brian asked as he put his hand on my back. Before I could answer, there was a loud shot that echoed through the trees, and we both looked at the direction it came from. "We must have found the animal," I said as I split into the grass. As soon as I said that, we could now see Eric, but he was full on sprinting. "Run!" he screamed as he ran at us. I noticed that must have dropped his gun because he wasn't carrying it. I was about to ask him what happened, but Brian grabbed my arm and yanked me towards where he had parked the truck. Without hesitation, I ran. We soon made it back to the truck, and my shoulder hurt from the rubbing of the gun strap. I looked back at Eric, who slowed down for nothing. I soon looked behind him and saw nothing chasing us, so I opened the truck and got in without worry. Eric then climbed in and told me to hit the gas and go. I was so perplexed on what Eric saw out there, and I knew that he hardly ever got scared of anything, so this started to freak me out. I started driving fast back to the camp, and I asked Eric, "What did you see out there that was scary enough to make you drop your gun?" "I don't know, man. That was no damn animal. I followed the trail of blood and I stopped at the base of a tree, and I was wondering how a coyote was able to climb a tree. But when I looked up, I saw this hairy humanoid creature there. It smelled so freaking bad." Eric went on about how scary that thing was and how he was done with the hunting trip and wanted to go home. We soon pulled into camp and mutually decided that we were going home. I started to pack my things and then felt like something was missing. I then thought to myself, "Lucy, where is Brian's dog? She usually always is so excited to see us back at camp. She can't stop barking and whining to be set free." As soon as I thought this, Brian started screaming and crying. I ran over to where he was and saw that his dog was gone. However, on further inspection, I noticed what Brian was looking at. Something had pulled out the metal stake in the ground and strung Lucy up on a nearby tree and had skinned her. Brian just could not stop crying, and Eric ran over to see what was wrong and just stood there, jaw dropped and frozen. He then muttered, "She was skinned alive. There's a bunch of bruising caused by struggling around her neck where the collar is." "Shut up, Eric, you ain't helping," I said as I put my shoulder around Brian, who had unstrung his dog's body from the tree. "Skinwalker," Eric said in a lower tone of voice as he looked into the distance. He then screamed, "It's a damn skinwalker!" I followed his gaze and saw an animal that looked like Lucy, but it had human eyes and a sickly green glaze looking coat fur. Brian stopped crying and just stood there, eyes locked on the beast. Eric then whispered with his voice quivering, "We all run to the truck on a count of 3. Just leave everything else." Brian and I slowly nodded and agreed to the plan. "Okay, 3, 2, 1. Eric whispered more sharply, and we all took off like a pack of gazelles for the truck. We hopped in, and soon as we did, we saw the skinwalker lunge at us and struck the right side door with such a powerful blow that nearly tipped over the whole truck. It didn't stop me whatsoever, and I drove out of there faster than I ever could have. After that, none of us ever went hunting again in that area. We never even went back to claim our camping trailers and supplies. It was too terrifying to think that what happened to Brian's dog could happen to us and that thing would walk around in our skin. Since that experience, I am now a superstitious person. Skinwalker stories from the past. This is a story my family told me when I was growing up. We live in a rural community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her two brothers were home alone while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they didn't have electricity. It had been dark outside for about an hour, and my aunt and my uncles were getting ready for bed. Outside, they heard noises, as if someone moving things around outside. My oldest uncle went to look out the front window and saw a figure out by the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary because the closest neighbor was miles away. Whatever it was opened the truck door and began to dig through the personal items that my family had left in the vehicle. My aunt and uncles were frightened by the sight and knew that they should take action. They took out the rifle and all steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door and aimed the gun at the dark figure. The figure turned and started to walk towards them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The figure drew closer and my aunt began to smell something like a rotting corpse. It was so strong, it made her gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger with no luck, and the figure came closer and closer. Off the distance, headlights were coming up the road. My grandparents were returning. The figure looked towards the lights and started to move away and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. My oldest uncle ran towards the truck with a gun. My grandfather got out of the car and my uncle pointed to the tree. The thing was poking out its head to observe what they were doing. My grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove and grabbed a handful of ashes. I rubbed over the gun and placed the ash-covered bullet inside the chamber. He walked out onto the porch and fired towards the tree. Whatever that thing was didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed and the dark figure began running. My grandma chased my aunt inside and my uncles and my grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so as my grandfather and uncles chased after the figure, the truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed on one particular spot. My uncle swears that whenever the headlights would hit the figure, he saw a woman. Not only that, whoever it was running on all fours like a bear. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck, and as they neared the ditch that drops about 20 feet, he got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared and that he knew it was her and to leave his family alone. A few days passed and there was news that the woman that my grandfather was yelling at had passed. I've always been told that if you know who the Skinwalker is, say their name and it will finally kill them. It's been over 10 years. I never shared this story or understood what I saw until now. Hi everybody, I just told this story for the first time ever to some family at my aunt and uncle's cabin up north. We all live in Wisconsin, but their cabin is in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The whole family comes up a few times every summer to spend a weekend or week together. At the campfire last night, we went from sharing hunting stories, though I've never been a big hunter myself, to weirder ones. Not scary stories, really. Just things we've experienced or heard that we don't have explanations for. I've been convinced by one of my cousins to post my only campfire story last night to no sleep here. This takes place about 10 to 12 years ago when my family took a road trip out west, as we say. I was probably 7 or 8. Anyway, I remember this happened just before we turned around and started coming back home. We've been through Mount Rushmore, Yellowstone, and I can't remember its name for the life of me. But we went to some sort of dinosaur sculpture park in Utah too. In Utah, we met up with some of my parents' old colleague friends who lived there now. The whites, their names and all names, have been changed for privacy, and drove out to a small town to stay a night or two with them. The place reminded me a bit of my grandparents' house. The nearest neighbors were within sight, maybe half a mile away. Not exactly isolated, but spacious. So after a few hours of driving from the dinosaur park, the whites grilled us dinner outside, and in true Wisconsin fashion, had some beers with my parents on the porch after. My sister, 14 to 15 years old, and I were playing in the backyard too, with the white's autistic son, Kyle, who is between me and my sister's age, but I haven't seen him since, so I'm not 100% sure on his age. Well, we come across this really bad smell, like burning, singed arm hair. If you know what that's like. And suddenly, Kyle starts acting strange. He couldn't really speak clearly anyway, but he kept freezing and looking around frantically. He was shaking his head and making lots of noises. Eventually, the kid started breaking down and crying, like he was overwhelmed or we bullied him or something. I'm 8. I don't know what to do. I ask my sister. She takes off to tell the whites and tells me to stay with Kyle. I get kind of nervous and start telling Kyle we should go back to the house. I heard my dad talking and laughing nearby, but couldn't see where he was. "Dad!" I yelled out. A few seconds later, both our parents come running over with my sister. Mr. White's got a shotgun, and I'm immediately terrified. What was going on? My mum and Mrs. White start calling our names. "Dan, come on over," and "Kyle, it's okay, sweetie, come here," Mr. White barked. "Get over here now," like he was pissed as all hell. We both bolted, and Mr. White immediately starts firing into the shrubs behind us. I turned around and saw what Kyle was crying at, and what Mr. White was repelling. A huge, gangly coyote was taking off. I'd heard coyotes back in Wisconsin, but never saw one. From what the parents were saying, I gathered that this thing was pretty big and dangerous. Mr. White said it must be rabid or starving, because they usually don't come so close to the house. The whites didn't have any farm animals or anything, nothing to attract any predators. Apparently, Mr. White had seen it a few days prior and warned Kyle, which made him freak when he actually saw it up close. The parents suggested we all come back inside before sundown, and I was glad to. I think I started crying after that close call. My dad and Mr. White did a sweep of the house as my mum and sister tried to comfort me. That night I was starting to feel better after a movie. I was showing Kyle my dinosaur toy collection in the living room when there was a sound at the door to the back porch. For context, the house was L-shaped. We were in the long part of the L, while my parents and sister were in the sunroom, which was around the corner in the flat part. We both stop and get a bit creeped out. But eventually, I go back to showing off my toys. The sound happens again. It's like a really weak knock without a rhythm. I hear Mrs. White talking through the door, but she sounds plastered. I didn't know what being drunk felt like back then, but I'd already been to enough family reunions to know that it made adults act and speak weird. Mrs. White sounded like she could barely string a sentence together, so I yelled a nervous, "Hey Mum," down the hall. Not a second later, I hear a scream come from the sunroom. Kyle starts crying, so I freak out and sprint for my parents. I see Mr. White wiping the sliding glass door, and I swear to God, this coyote is back. Except now, he's standing on his hind legs and clawing at the door to the living room. Mr. White opens fire, and it turns around and takes off into the dark behind the house. I smell that burnt hair smell again. Everybody's swearing and freaking out, and my mum scoops me up. "You need to leave," Mr. White tells me. My dad. "Now, Tim, get in your car and go." Mrs. White is crying and making a phone call by now, so my parents quickly grab our bags and usher me and my sister into our van with my Mr. White, who still has his shotgun. We say goodbye to him and leave. Our car passes another as we head out, and I watched as it stopped at the White's house. I don't know what happened after that. I dozed off eventually. As for the last detail, I don't know if this was a nightmare or just a scared, shitless kid's imagination. But at one point I opened my eyes and saw this effing deformed coyote thing running alongside our van. It glanced at me and took off before I could get a good look at it. But I never saw it again after that. Eventually we got to a town with a hotel and continued along our vacation the next morning as planned. Nothing else happened as we returned home, aside from the usual road trip stuff, of course. Really, the thing that unnerves me to this day about this story is that there are so many details that don't add up or make any sense. It was such an unsettling day, and maybe I remembered things incorrectly or forgot details too. The Whites moved to Colorado soon after, but I don't know if the two are related. I wouldn't be surprised. Raising a kid with a thing like that lurking around your house would be terrifying. Anyway, what's your assessment, folks? Note: I had to report this as the original was in violation of a rule. Like I said, I'm new here and still getting used to the format. But it's a bit of a blessing in disguise, as now I can update everyone. Commenters on my last post said that I've encountered a skinwalker. I've always been a skeptic on generally everything, but the connections have seriously have me spooked. Stories I've read since last night about skinwalkers are eerily similar to mine. And though I'm not 100% convinced, it's certainly something for me to think about. I can't wait to tell my cousins about this. So, what are Wendigos? In some traditions, humans that were overpowered by greed could turn into Wendigos. The myth thus served as a method of encouraging cooperation and moderation. Other sources say Wendigos were created when the human resorted to cannibalism to survive. Humans could also turn into Wendigos by being in contact with them for too long. So these were the three theories as to how Wendigos came about. Let's look at 3 stories now that contain Wendigos. Number 1. First encounter. Hello again. As I have seen some of you wanted to hear the stories I have to tell. I have one too many to post in just one paragraph, so I'll chop them up and let you guys decide whether or not you want more. I live in a small town in northeastern Pennsylvania that is surrounded by farms and endless forests. As a kid, I spent most of my time fishing for trout or building stick forts. Now I have bonfires and I deer hunt. So as you can imagine, I'm outside most of the time. At this point, I know almost every paw print or call of the local animals, and I can identify it almost immediately. At the age of 13, I went over to one of my friend's houses for his birthday party, mid-June, alongside another two guys. We used to hang out a lot, but after this incident, things happened and we broke apart and went our own ways. Anyways, we were crazy and imagining exploring abandoned places and finding paranormal spirits, as all the YouTubers did at the time. About 3 miles into the forest, there was an abandoned quarry. All of us were excited to explore it, so we got the birthday boy, his name is Aiden, to lie to his dad and say we were going for a walk through the woods. Aiden's dad said yes, but to not wander off too far, and to pay attention to the trees due to the number of mountain lion sightings in the area recently. Many say they don't live here in Pennsylvania, said to be a boogeyman of sorts, but I've seen one with my own eyes and I can tell you they're here along with wolves. We gear up and grabbed our phones and knives. Well, at the time I didn't have a knife, but I borrowed one from one of the big guys. His name was Clayton, and he's a little out of shape, putting it nicely. He usually brought up to 10 knives to our parties like some sort of serial killer. Sometimes he made me worry. He also gave one to our fourth guy named Marcellus. More ghetto than country boy, but it's okay, we got along at the time. As we packed our bags and got ready, we poked fun at each other. Me insulting Aiden's choice of footwear, wearing a pair of black and white Vans, while the rest of us wore boots. Clayton poking fun at me for being the smallest guy in the group, and Marcellus backing up Clayton's insults. As we headed out the door, excited for what we were going to find in the amazing abandoned quarry, imagining old mine shafts deep in the ground where coral was mined or copper, the air seemed to change. Change as in heavier, like when a kid in class threatens to kill everyone in the room. Yeah, that kind of heavy. Almost a primitive fear. As I eerily looked around, curious about what installed this primitive fear into my system, the others talked about what we were going to find. I think we are going to find some coal. Maybe we can sell it to some local farmer, commented Clayton in an almost wishful sort of way. It's a quarry, dumbass, not a mine shaft, yelled Aiden, furious with Clayton's idiotic comment. Aiden had a tendency to get angry over the stupidest of mistakes. Even a misspoken word was enough to set him off. Same thing, mine shaft, quarry, your mum's, all things worth exploring, Clayton said in a mocking tone. Shut the up before I rock your world, fat, Aiden yelled in rage, almost about to throw a fist and knock his teeth out. As Marcellus calmed down, both of them down, I zoned out. As we were walking into the woods, now after going through a long field, the feeling of dread was getting stronger, and I almost wanted to run. I knew I was being watched. I always know when someone stares at me in class. I usually look directly at them when I notice the feeling. I started to scan my surroundings. Maple trees, rocks, cliffs, bones, birds, beehives. Wait, bones? I backtracked to where I seen bones and looked a little closer. About 60 yards away, at the bottom of a cliff, was a dead deer. Fresh blood still on its bones, flesh hanging from its skull. I imagined the thing that could have mutilated it so badly, and thought of a 1,000-pound black bear with rabies. Honestly, now I wish it just was a bear. Hey, dipstick, I'm talking to you, Clayton pegged me with a rock and broke my trance. What do you want, man? I said, clearly annoyed. I said, what the hell are you looking at? Clayton barked, irritated that I didn't respond sooner. Nothing. Come on, let's get going. Still another 2.5 miles till we reach the quarry. Nothing exciting happened as we climbed a large hill. I felt the air get heavier and my primal fear clawing its way up my spine as if it's about to dig itself out. Once we reached the top of the hill, there was a level part still filled with maple and birch trees and some decent sized rocks. There was a barbed wire fence that led to a clearing, freshly mowed like a field. Aiden commented saying that was his property and his neighbor probably was trespassing again. As we got to the fence, I noticed something red hanging from the fence. A rag or piece of clothing covered in dried blood, and underneath it was a rusted old knife with a saw blade on one side and a sharp edge on the other. Me and Marcellus argued for a minute about who got the knife, and I gave in and let him have it. We crawled under the fence and walked through the field. Right now we were only about half a mile away from the quarry. I zoned out again as we walked. No one was talking about anything exciting anyway, and I scanned my surroundings when my fear jumped, almost right out of me. I couldn't place it as I frantically looked around. Something bad, no, something evil was nearby and I could sense it. I was at the back of the line so no one noticed my panic. I went tree to tree, scanning for something out of place, and when I got to a birch tree, roughly 25 yards away, I saw it. There was a large, lengthy, grey hand wrapped around the tree. I could almost make out claws. I looked up above the hand and I could just barely see the edge of a head. I looked at my friends who got a little bit ahead of me, looked back at the tree and the grey thing was gone. I ran to catch up with my friends, deciding to keep what I just saw quiet so I'm not made fun of for the rest of the weekend. We finally started to see a clearing up ahead with another barbed wire fence. We walked through a patch of thorn bushes about as tall as me, and they shredded our bare torsos as we took off our shirts and hung them from our shoulders. We crouched under the fence and made it to the quarry. Now almost 50 years later, it was just some old cow pasture. We were a little bummed out as we were hoping for the ultimate mineshaft experience, but we knew logically what we would find. There was this cool little part where the rock was cut out, leaving a 10-foot drop below to the cow pasture. We went over there and screwed around on the cliff. It was roughly 100 yards away from the tree line, so we were a little far from the woods. There was a pallet with some perfect cut square rocks in it, and we looked through them, fascinated by how precise they were. But in the end, we just left them. Aiden got the idea to take some Instagram pictures, and as we got into position to take photos for our pages, Aiden, we all spun around towards the far woods, hearing his dad, but it was off, almost mechanical. Startled by how quiet it was, almost a whisper, but the woods were 100 yards away. My fear crawled its way into me, and I wanted to go home, knowing something was wrong. Guys, we need to go, I stated, walking towards the tree line. The others followed. My fear grew stronger and stronger. I scanned the field, then the cliff, then the trees. As I was walking, we were at the tree line, scrambling under the fence. Snap! A branch cracked not too far from us. We all looked. Marcellus still under the fence, and we saw it. 20 yards away was this 9-foot human-like animal. No, not animal. It stood on 2 legs like a human. Its grey skinny arms ended at its knees, and its claws were as big as its hands. It was partially crouched, perching its elbows on its knees, staring at us with its hot red eyes. Teeth stuck out of its mouth like a piranha with large canines like a dog. Its teeth were an ugly yellowish and blackish colour, with some blood stain on its top row. We all stood, frozen and staring at this beast. Then its eyes snapped to me. It made eye contact and twitched. In fear, I let out a gasp. Its eyes perked up as it heard this, as if in pleasure. It slowly stood up, breaking my trance, and I jumped into flight mode. "Run!" I screamed, making a dash for home. The field only 50 yards away, the creature let out an almost metallic, human, bear-like roar. Its scream filled me with fear, and I could sense the hate in its veins. This monster was primal fear. We ran like hell as it chased after us, dodging left and right, changing direction, tripping it up so it can't catch us. We dove under the barbed wire fence and kept running. I looked back to see it hurdle the fence like it was nothing. Hot on our heels, running on all fours, I tripped over a branch and rolled, catching myself and kept running. But this put me at the back of the line. I felt its hot breath on my back as it ran. It let out another scream, and I jumped off the nearby cliff to my right. My friends did the same. It was only a 15-foot drop onto some dead leaves and grass, so we landed somewhat nicely, except I rolled my ankle in the process and Aiden landed his knee on a rock. I looked back and saw I almost landed on the deer corpse from earlier, and that gave me a spark of renewed energy. The tree line was only 300 yards away, and we ran like hell. We heard a screeching and scrambling down the hill at full speed. We vaulted over rocks and slid under fallen trees, and this thing was right on us the whole time, teeth bared and roaring in hatred. I knew the only goal this abomination had was to mutilate us like the deer. We ran and ran. Then it roared again, this time sounding almost in defeat. We cleared the tree line and ran to the road. We turned back around to see where it was, and it stood in the tree line, almost out of view, but still visible enough to see it. "Even," it croaked in a voice so unnatural and satanic, almost like the demons in movies, but more metallic. I didn't mention this before, but my name is Even. My friends always call each other mean things, so we rarely said our real names. Instead of primal fear, this time I felt primal rage. I puffed out my chest and slammed my hands on my pecs. "You want a piece of me, you ugly son of a—" "Come at me," I screamed, a little unsettled by my primal outburst. This thing simply smiled, turned around, and walked away. We all looked at each other and went back to the house. Aiden's dad didn't hear the scream, so we had to explain nothing. We went and hid in his room in silence. None of us really talked about it much except for me. If I was to ask them now about it, they would probably say it was just a bear and that we overreacted. But I'm telling you now, there was more to come to prove suspicious. At least to me. So that was part 1. Leave a comment if you want to hear more stories. Number 2. Fear in the Woods. This story is 100% true, and I'm writing it on here to warn other people and let them know that there's definitely something out there. And to this day, I still don't know what it was, nor have I gone into any woods or forests whatsoever. If you don't believe me, that's completely fine. Read this as a fun story at your own expense. But for those of you out there with an open mind, or you've seen something yourself, just know you're not alone. And just typing it out and remembering this account is causing me to shake with anxiety and fear. First off, I am a girl and live in North Carolina of the United States. I was 15 at the time of my encounter and was definitely not a believer in anything supernatural, paranormal, or anything of the sort. It happened while I was at the local summer camp. There was absolutely nothing special about that day. No weird lights, people, animals, sounds, nothing. It was just the same camp schedule as I'd grown used to in the past 2 weeks I'd been there. My age group had just finished lunch and was able to persuade our counselor to let us play a game called Scatter Down by the Lake. It's like a giant hide and seek in the woods. Now, we had played this at least 20 times before that day, and nothing weird had happened to any of us, and we all grew up playing in the woods. So it's not like we had an aversion of fear of it. But for some reason that day, when our counselor shouted scatter and I ran to find a hiding place, it became a whole new ball game. I had run as far as I could while still being able to see the lake, as were the rules, and had found a large old uprooted tree that I decided would be the perfect hiding place. So I lay down as close as I could against the ground and waited. I had been there for about 5 minutes when I suddenly heard a voice calling my name in a weird, dreamy-like voice, and not just any voice, my mum's. Now, me and my mum are extremely close, thick as thieves, so I'd know her voice anywhere, and I would swear on my own grave that it was without a doubt hers. But I knew it couldn't be her. She was 20 miles away at work, and even if it had actually been her, and she'd come to pick me up early, the voice wasn't coming from the lake. It was coming further out in the woods, beyond the border of the camp. I knew I should have run away from this strange mimic mum voice, but I couldn't. It was almost hypnotic. It messed with my thoughts and gave me doubts like, well, it could be mum, or what if she's hurt and I have to get to her? All these things were flooding into my mind like someone had broken a dam I didn't know was there, until they finally overwhelmed me and emotion got the better of me and I took off running in the direction the voice was coming from. I ran as fast as I could, with only this strange voice as my guide. I couldn't have run for more than 5 or 7 minutes when I got to the clearing and the voice suddenly stopped. When I entered the clearing and didn't hear my mum's voice calling me anymore, I finally thought clearly again and started to have little alarm bells go off inside my head saying, "You idiot," or "That's not mum," and "Run." But I couldn't run. I didn't know where to run. I had gotten so far away, I had lost sight of the lake by camp and had absolutely no idea where I was, and I was completely exhausted to boot. With no other options than to sit and catch my breath, I did just that. No sooner I sat down, more warning bells went off in my mind. I quickly did a 360 survey around the clearing and noticed a strange noise. It wasn't the continuation of the voice before, no, it was the distinct sound of chattering teeth, like if you were cold. Only there was no one else around, and it was the middle of June in North Carolina. There's no way someone could be cold. And that's when I heard it. Leaves and sticks crunch on the edge of the small clearing, and I realized something was watching me. And then whatever it was moved and fast in circles around the clearing, almost like it was circling prey. And it was at that moment I knew whatever it was had led me out there, away from the rest of my group, exactly like the predator. My instincts had been screaming at me that it was. Without any other option other than to try and escape, I took off in the direction I thought I came from and sprinted as fast as I could, all the while hearing the chittering of teeth and sticks crunching behind me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't dare turn around, see what was chasing me. I knew that if I did, I would slow down, and I absolutely would not. It felt like a lifetime running away from this thing before I finally saw the lake, and even though I didn't think I could, I ran faster than I ever have in my life. When I broke the tree line, I ran to the lake where I knew my friends were. At that point, I felt safe enough to stop and look back and see just what had been chasing me. But when I did, I only saw a fleeting form running back the way I had come, and the distinct sound of chittering teeth. When I finally found my counselor, I was hysterical with fear and hugged her as tight as I could. When I finally calmed down, she tried to get me to tell her what happened, but I just asked, "Why are you calling my name?" Before she even said anything, I already knew the answer. After all, it had been my mum's voice that led me away from everyone else. But what she replied with, was so much more bone-chilling to me. She told me, "No one called for you. We didn't know you were gone. Everyone is still hiding. The game isn't over yet." Number 3. Wendigo in Wisconsin. This is still hard for me to wrap my head around because it shook me to my core. But this story takes place just over a year ago, in late November 2018. I live in a rural suburban in SEWI, near a line of woods and ponds. My town is small and everything is silent and dark by 9 p.m. I tend to walk my dog after dinner and before bed, and my town is pretty safe, so walking her in the dark never fazed me until this. I live in an apartment complex that is on the end of a residential street, so most of the street is older houses. One night I was walking my dog around 10:30 p.m. I think, when I saw something on the front lawn of one of these houses. They didn't have a light on their front porch, so most of their lawn was dark. But with lights from the surrounding houses, I could see a figure standing in the middle of their lawn. It was very tall and skinny, almost as tall as the roof of their ranch house, because even standing in the middle of the front yard, it looked almost as tall as the house. It was standing on its hind legs, but had antlers or some type of tall ears like a bunny, and its arms and legs were abnormally long and stretched to the bone. The moment I saw it, my body froze, and I had that feeling that you only get when you're near immediate danger or evil. So this tall, lanky creature is standing there, and I can't see its face, but by its positioning, I know it has noticed me. Also, my dog, who is normally aware of every living creature from a mile away in a snowstorm, is completely unaware of its presence. It felt like longer, but it was only a few seconds before this creature jumped straight up in the air. And I mean straight up, not forward, and bounded to the back of the house in 3 large strides. It didn't make a sound, and the way it jumped and moved was unlike any animal I've ever seen. The closest I would akin to it would be a deer, and it was on its hind legs, and had the body features of a stretched out human, but with antlers or tall ears. I felt stuck, and almost hypnotized by the whole thing, but came to my senses enough to call attention to my dog, and turned around to head for home. Behind all of the houses on this side of the street is woods, and some of the trees wrap around between this house and the neighboring house, coming back towards home. We turned around, my eyes glued to the trees, and when we got to the middle of the houses, I could see 2 eyes watching me through the 2 houses. The presence and overall weight of the feeling this whole encounter gave me still sticks with me as clearly as the night it happened. I can remember it all so vividly and still feel the weight. Ever since that night, I've been thinking about it and running through all of the possibilities of what it could be, but always coming up with no explanation. It wasn't until about a month ago that I was watching a special on supernatural encounters that I heard about Wendigos. The description fit perfectly and made my blood run even colder. I'm fully convinced that what I saw that night had to have been a Wendigo. I made a point to only walk my dog during the daylight during the summer months, and on the connecting street that is the main road of my town. that is at least lit with streetlights in the winter when it gets dark before I'm even home from work. Since that night, I haven't had any other direct encounter with it, except one event that I'm not sure is related, but feels the same. The same feeling of being watched. Across from my apartment complex, there is a small pond surrounded by trees. A few weeks ago, my brother was over and he was outside smoking when he came in quickly and locked the door behind him. I had mentioned my encounter to him when it first happened, but he shrugged it off like most people I told, and likely didn't give it a second thought. He looked shaken and kept looking through the peephole in my door and not saying anything. He finally got out that he was outside smoking and heard loud dragging and rustling sounds coming from the wooded pond area. He said he was listening for about a minute and thought he caught a glimpse of something very tall near the tree line. He described it as a sound they would make if someone were dragging a heavy animal or body through rough brush woods, and he had a feeling of dread and heaviness, like he couldn't look away and was being honed in on by something. Normally, I'm the type of person that would go out and look for myself, maybe even going down by the pond to explore and find something, but this case shuts all of that down. There's something viscerally evil about this creature that not even I care to explore further. I've tried telling people in my life about all of this, but as most people do with this type of stuff, none of them really put any stock into it, except my brother now that he's had this experience. I'm of the mind that things beyond our comprehension and everyday scope absolutely do exist, and this is one I won't be messing with or going on adventures to see again. Legends and beliefs exist for a reason, and this is one I don't want to mess with. So Wendigo in my neighborhood, let's not meet. The Wendigo. I'm writing everything down in this journal to document our journey to Fort Kent and the subsequent events that transpired afterward. I hope that whoever finds this journal will publicize what had happened in this town to us between the dates of January 12th to February 13, 2018. Do you know of the Fort Kent Wendigo in Alberta, Canada? Most would say it is an urban legend, but after what I have read and experienced, my view has taken 180-degree turn. It all started when myself and a group of 3 friends wanted to make a Bollywood movie about the Wendigo. After spending 2 weeks of researching the Wendigo and what they look like, I found the Wendigo of Fort Kent. Some say that a doctor locked himself in his house with his dead wife that had just died of smallpox. Then he ate her and turned into the Wendigo. Along with his wife, many of the townsfolk died from smallpox. Once the man left his home, he killed and ate the remaining dozen or so residents of the town. No one is really sure about what happened, but there is one fact no one can deny. Fort Kent became a ghost town, and no one really knows why. After finding out all of this information, I knew that we had a great idea for a movie. The only problem was the place was pretty isolated. So if we got into any trouble, it would be days before anyone would be able to help them. Luckily, Bobby's parents were filthy rich, since they were both plastic surgeons. They spoiled Bobby rotten and gave him everything he wanted. Even so, he was a pretty down-to-earth guy and one of my best friends. Along with Bobby, there was Mike and Kyle. As for myself, the producer of the soon-to-be movie, my name is Tara. So we took off in a small jet, heading from Ottawa, Ontario, Canada to Elk Point Airport, Alberta. We took a fancy Canon 80D DSLR camera with us to shoot the movie, as well as a portable film mixer. a wireless microphone system, a shotgun microphone and boom pro, wind protection for the mics, a field recorder, and headphones. Along with all that equipment, we brought camping equipment. When we got to Elk Point Airport, we rented a Hyundai Tucson, loaded it with all of our equipment, and headed for Bonnieville. Now, it usually takes 45 minutes to an hour to drive to Bonnieville, but we were going in January. They had just gotten 24 centimeters of snow, and the roads were heavy with snow. It took us 3 hours to get to Bonnieville, where we got groceries and lots of alcohol for our month stay in the ghost town of Fort Kent. For a bit of background, the four of us have been friends since elementary and just graduated high school. We decided to take a year off before heading to college, and came up with the bright idea of making a horror movie. Bobby's parents had given Bobby the sound equipment and camera as a graduation present. We spent the summer figuring out what we were going to film when we came across the urban legend of the Wendigo of Fort Kent. Since then, we have been obsessed about the film. After we had gotten the essentials needed for our trip to the ghost town, we headed for the fort. January 12th, 2018, Day 1. We arrived in Fort Kent around 2 p.m. It took us 4 hours to set up all the tents and gear. We decided to set up near the outskirts of town. For some reason, we felt more comfortable here. No one said anything, but everyone got more nervous the further we went into town. By the time we were all set up, the sun had already set, and we couldn't see anything past the glow of the bonfire. We decided to drink the night away, talking about all the things we would do once the morning came. Around 10 p.m, we started to notice snowflakes starting to fall. We huddled around the fire more, but when the wind started picking up as well, we decided to call it a night. We had 2 tents set up, one for me and Mike, and the other one for Kyle and Bobby. Mike and I lay on top of a blow-up queen-size mattress that had 3 heavy covers on top of it. The 2 of us got under the blankets and looked up at the ceiling. I could feel Mike trying to get into my pants, but I shrugged him off. This place was giving me a bad vibe, and I wasn't in the mood. The walls of the 8-person tent shook as the wind and snow pummeled against the tent, making it difficult to hear anything. At the time, I didn't think anything of it, but I swore I thought I could hear the howl of a wolf through the sound of the wind. January 13, 2018, Day 2. I woke up around 6 a.m. this morning to Mike snoring beside me. His arm was draped around me as my eyes slowly opened. The tent was still and the sound of the wind was silent. I brought my hand up to his arm and pulled it off me. I rolled off the bed and pulled myself off the floor. I quickly got dressed. To my surprise, it was warmer inside than I thought it would have been. I put on a parka and 2K and opened the flap that led outside. A foot of snow fell into the tent the moment the flap was opened. I let out a startled silent meep and jumped back. I looked behind me, wondering if I had awoken Mike. To my relief, he was still snoring away. I composed myself and pulled myself out of the tent and into the snow. The snow crunched under my boots as I walked outside. I stood a 5 foot 8 inches and had the snow reach up to my knees. So overnight we had gotten a fair amount of snow. So it took me by complete surprise when I saw a set of footprints traveling through the snow around our tents. I figured that Bowie must have gotten up during the night and had a smoke. So again, I didn't think much of it. I looked towards the town. 2 run-down houses stood about 100 feet away. Then I looked to my right and saw our rental vehicle completely covered in snow. I spent the next 2 hours cleaning of the vehicle of snow. By the time I had finally gotten it cleaned, the rest of my friends had gotten up and started walking around. Bobby had taken out his camera and started to film the area. The last I had seen him, was him heading into town with Kyle, while Mike came over to me. We talked a while about the project we were working on. We didn't have any shovels, so getting the SUV out of the area we were in was very difficult. Eventually, after much effort, we got the SUV out and onto the soft snow. The four-wheel drive made the situation a little better. We both got into the SUV and drove it through the town. We followed the footprints that seemed to go to each house in the town until finally the footprints went to a house and there weren't any footprints coming back out. We parked the SUV on the side of the road, got out and headed to the house. The footprints went too. Turns out the house had looked like someone had been living in it recently. We found them in the basement. Bobby was filming writing, which was covering every square inch of the basement. On one side of the wall it read, "Beware the Wendigo." As the writing went along the wall, the writing got more and more messy. By the end, the writing became scratches in the wall. Finally it read, "I am the Wendigo." We did some more shooting, making an introduction to the movie. By the time 4 p.m. came around, we decided to head back to the campground and pack it in for the night. By the time we got back to camp, it was pitch black outside. We parked the SUV beside the tents and all four of us headed inside, mine and Mike's tent. We continued to drink and had a cold dinner from soup cans. We played cards until 10 p.m., right until we heard a howl coming right outside of our tent. We had been talking very loudly, so we hadn't heard it approach. We could hear that sound of crunching snow under heavy footprints. Then its shadow cast itself on the tent, and the only thing we could see were its legs. Not only was the creature bipedal, but it was huge. Mike was about to open the flap to check what it was, when we heard the sound of metal being torn to pieces, the sound of a car alarm going off as it did. I wanted to scream, but I was too terrified to do so. Soon the sound of metal being torn to shreds stopped and silence ensued. I was about to let out a sigh of relief when I heard another howl. Then the sound of the other tent being torn to shreds could be heard. After another 5 minutes the sound faded and we could hear the creature walking away from our tents. We waited until midnight to get out of our tent and see the damage. The car and tent were destroyed. We had left most of our food in the car, and from what we could see, there was no food left. Kyle started to cry and Bobby tried to console her, while Mike and I just stood there in shock, wondering what we would do next. Bobby had brought his camera into our tent, but the sound equipment he had been in his tent and was now destroyed as well. We realized that our project was finished and we would have to go back to Bonnieville in the morning. We didn't get much sleep that night, and this was only the tip of the iceberg. Our stay in Fort Kent was only just starting. And after this, there was no update. So what could have happened to our little friends in this case? Was it a Wendigo? What was it? We will never know. This is how you kill a Wendigo. My twin sister, Janessa, was murdered at age 16. I witnessed it like a coward from atop a tree in the forest where it happened. I'd actually blacked out the memory for a while. I knew she was dead, but I couldn't remember how it happened. It wasn't until I tried therapy that it slowly came back to me. I was also reminded of how much my parents used to fight. Our family was planning on a camping trip the day before my sister's death. Before leaving, my parents erupted into another massive fight. Janessa and I had been looking forward to the trip, and once again, our parents' awful communication skills was ruining it before it even began. We snuck out of the house and took a lift to the forest. We left our phones at home, not caring whether our parents would be worried sick. We enjoyed ourselves the first day. I set up our tent, made a fire, had s'mores, and all the stuff one typically associated with camping. The next morning, everything changed. I woke up alone in our tent. Outside, I hear my sister talking to someone. Inquisitive, I opened the tent and saw someone sitting at our now out campfire who looked just like me. The figure transformed as soon as Janessa realized it wasn't me. Together we ran off, that thing rushing after us with heavy steps. I was faster than my sister and a bit more athletic. I grabbed onto a tree branch and climbed up a tree. Janessa was not so lucky. I watched it happen. I watched that thing tear my sister to pieces. I am still haunted by her screams. I also understand now why she always appears badly mutilated in my nightmares. I stayed up in that tree overnight, my sister's corpse lying in the leaves, her remaining eye always staring up at me. While in therapy, there was a moment when I suddenly recalled the hallucination I had the morning after my sister's death. I thought I saw her corpse clawing at the tree where I hid. She wanted me to come down and join her. It caused me to panic and cry out. A couple of men who had been camping in the area heard my screams, and at last I was rescued. My parents don't argue anymore. I hardly see them at all anymore since my sister's death. We're an upper middle class family. Over the last couple of years, my parents have frequently gone on vacations. They don't tell me where, and I never ask. I usually just wake up and find out they've left yet again. I'm out of high school now, and I have no career path yet. I've only really had one thing on my mind since I remembered what killed Janessa. Now I'm returning to the forest where she died. Now I'm going to go after the thing that killed her. I have been preparing for this, and if it is a Wendigo like I've suspected, then I am more than ready to take my revenge. This is how I'm doing it. I took a lift again. Had the driver known what I was carrying in my bags, I doubt they would have let me in. As I sat there, the realization of what I was doing grew heavily on me. What the hell am I doing? I've been talking myself up for the last couple of years. As much as I want a glorious victory, the closer I've come to this day, the more I daydream about dying the same way Janessa did. As angry as I am with my parents, I don't think they deserve to lose their only remaining child. But I just can't move on, knowing that thing is still out there. My legs were as dense as gold once I tried to exit the cab. The driver watched awkwardly as I struggled to pull myself out while putting on my backpack and working to carry the other supplies. Why was I doing this alone? I don't want anyone else getting hurt in this, I think was my reasoning. But God, I wish I wasn't out here doing this alone. With each step I took into the forest, the more the terror numbed. I was in the domain of the Wendigo now. I wasn't entirely sure how much of the information about them was real. I knew they could change their appearance. I know that their true form is just like the drawings people have made. There's no way to be an expert on these things unless you've actually dealt with one. I am still not sure why it decided not to come after me. Based on its size, I doubt it would have had any difficulty. Instead, I'm still alive and crazy enough to come back and pick a fight. As I set up camp, I found myself jumping at the sound of any bird call or movement from a nearby animal. The way I hammered in my tent, I knew I was calling attention to myself. In my left pants pocket was a gun. Like werewolves, I had heard that silver bullets were necessary to kill Wendigos. What if I'm wrong? A thought that had been with me ever since I'd stepped foot back into these woods. I stopped frequently while setting out. Behind a nearby tree, I was almost certain I could see someone watching me, and then hiding behind it again. I didn't bother to walk over and check it out. I finished up my tent and made up my sleeping bag inside. As I did this, I heard calls that sounded almost human off in the distance. It probably knew I was here. The minutes went by slowly, but soon dusk set upon the forest. I built a fire like the one Janessa and I had made. I roasted 2 marshmallows. Despite her absence, I made a s'more for her as well, resting it on a sizable rock near the fire. As I ate it, I thought about our last night together. All things considered, it was pleasant. Being twins, we had moments where we'd gotten into arguments like our parents. We'd fought one another. We had our problems, but that night had been pleasant. I'd actually been glad we decided to camp without our parents. As frightened as I still was, I felt a warmth, not from the fire. A sense of calm overcame me as my memories were suddenly flooded with the good times Janessa and I had. The good times were not for long. I could hear footsteps not far behind me. Jeremy. I could never forget that voice. It sounded just like Janessa, but I knew it wasn't her. For some reason, I felt compelled to sit there calmly. As it approached, I could tell it was going over to take a seat at the rock where I left the s'more. I glanced delicately to my right. I watched as a figure that looked almost identical to Janessa. I remembered pick up the s'more and take a bite. "That's not yours," I surprised myself, blurting that out. The fair Janessa ignored me, continuing to scarf it down. My terror turned to anger. The thing responsible for my sister's death was standing right next to me, mocking my grief. I didn't wait for it to finish. I pulled out my gun and pointed it directly at the figure. Before I could fire, the creature jumped to the left and turned around. I was struck with paralysis when I saw the mutilated face of my sister's corpse staring back at me. "I'm trapped, Jeremy." I struggled to keep aim. How dare that thing pretend to be her? "It won't let me go, and it won't let you go either. We can be together again. It's so much nicer than going home to an empty house and unloving parents." She held her hand out to me. "Trust me, brother, please." My trigger finger felt as though struck with a serious case of arthritis. Janessa took a step towards me. Wait, no, it's not Janessa. Why did I suddenly forget that? "Feed the forest with me, Jeremy. It's so much better being dead." "Prove it." At last I pulled the trigger. The creature hollowed in pain as it fell to the ground. I'd hit a lung, which wouldn't be enough, and I aimed the gun at its heart, but failed to pull the trigger as it rolled over and jumped back to its feet. Within seconds, it transformed from a corpse of my sister to its massive dog skeletal form with massive antlers. My mind was caught between fight and flight. I stood there aiming my gun, but desperately wanting to flee. As it rushed towards me, I chose the later option. I rushed over to the bag I'd left near the tent. Inside was a weapon I'd built myself. As I rushed over, I could tell I wasn't going to be able to outrun it. I fired another shot. The bullet lodged itself inside the neck of the beast. It cried out once more, buying me a bit of time to get to the bag. Why did I have it zipped up? As I tried to open it, the Wendigo rushed towards me again. Just like on the day of Janessa's death, I ran from the campsite further into the forest. History was repeating itself. I was going to fail to avenge my sister. My parents were going to lose their last remaining child. All because I couldn't let this go. After at least several minutes, I had somehow managed to keep outrunning it. I refused to slow down and look behind my shoulder. As I kept running, I noticed that I'd gone in some sort of circle. Up ahead of me was the campsite. I had a chance to grab the bag and pulled out the weapon. The closer I came to the campsite, the louder the Wendigo's footsteps became. I could almost feel the wind as the creature tried to claw at me. Once I reached the campsite, I put my hand out, clutching the bag. It felt like almost too great a risk to put my gun back in my pocket, but I needed it free to pull out the weapon. I managed to do just that and used my left hand to pull out a long metal spike. I had built it in such a way as to have the spike shoot out at the push of a button. The Wendigo wasn't going to slow down until he had me. I had no choice. I had to turn around. I had to have perfect timing. I had to collect my debt from the creature that took my twin sister. Chew on this, you son of a... I turned around, pressing the button that shot the spike out. Less than a foot from my face was the Wendigo. Its cry so loud my ears hurt and began to ring. I'd done it. The spike had pierced the heart. Silver, weakly, the Wendigo tried to swipe at me, but somehow lacked the strength. The next part was a gamble. I pulled out my gun and shot it in the head. It wasn't going to be enough to end the Wendigo, assuming what I'd read up was correct. I rushed back over to where I dropped my bag. Inside was a silver axe I'd also designed myself. When I returned, the creature was still conscious, letting out continuous, agonizing cries. I felt no sympathy. I hacked away at its wrists first. Its claws were the biggest threat, and I wanted them gone. Despite the weightlifting I'd been doing, it took over a dozen hacks to remove the first long-fingered hand. I pulled out my gun and shot it again in the head. It subdued the creature long enough for me to remove the second hand, and then I began on its head. As it began waking up again, I found myself screaming at the creature. I demanded it stay dead, calling it every insulting name that came to mind. Once I'd hacked most of the way away, though its head I pulled it off. I kicked it a couple of feet away. The Wendigo no longer moved. It took over an hour, but I'd managed to put each limb, the head and torso, in the trash bags I had brought along. One by one, I carried them back to the campsite. I lit another fire, burning each bag. It took until dawn for me to burn the body. I left the torso for last. It was a struggle, but I managed to remove the heart, rip it to pieces, and place it in a silver box. After locking it, I looked around the site and decided to leave everything except my gun and the box behind. I was never particularly religious, but in the months leading up to my fight, I'd gotten to know a priest at a church in my area called St. Alphonsus. Luckily for me, he was there when I arrived with the silver box. His face went several shades paler when I showed it to him. Nevertheless, he escorted me to the back of the church with a pair of shovels and helped me bury it. Once done, I sat there, suddenly flooded with overwhelming emotions. I did it. The Wendigo had been slain. I'd done it. My sister's killer was dead. Its body was burned, its heart in pieces and buried. Janessa, I cried out. I kept my promise. I killed it. The Wendigo can't get anyone else. It won't kill anyone else. I placed my lowered head in my hands and continued to cry. I'm sorry I wasn't braver before. I whimpered. I'm so sorry I wasn't stronger before. I placed some flowers on my sister's grave an hour later. I talked to her tombstone as though she was there listening. I'd like to believe she was, and that she was pleased with my accomplishment. Afterwards, I returned home and slept through the day and all night. Once morning came, I heard some noise downstairs. I went down to see that my parents were home and sitting down to breakfast. They stopped and looked over at me, saying nothing. I walked over and pulled up a seat. I had no appetite at all. How was your trip? Where did you guys go? My parents exchanged looks before my father replied, We went out west to visit your aunt and uncle. Did you enjoy it? I had difficulty keeping my chin from quivering as I lowered my head again. Jeremy, sweetie, what's wrong? Both my mother and my father got up and came over to me. Why do you keep leaving me alone, goddammit? I'm the only kid you have left. Don't you give a F about me? They hugged me tightly, offering apologies. I could have sworn I felt another pair of hands on my shoulders. Their light touch was the most comforting of all. I really hope Janessa is proud of me. But a new task was ahead of me now, a harder task perhaps. I was going to have to figure out how to reconcile with my parents. Our family had been broken long before her death. We'll never be whole again. But I know with some effort we can be better than this. I hope she can continue to give me the strength to put myself together as I progress into adulthood.